Hey everyone, welcome to Infinity Harry. If you are enjoying our interaction on Harry Potter and want to see more exciting content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. This video includes a self-recorded human introduction in the first 30 seconds, followed by AI generation for creative storytelling purposes. So today we're gonna see third part, what if Harry Potter manipulated fate to protect his brother. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe this channel and share with your friends. Now let's start the video.
Here is short summary. When destiny crowns his twin the boy who lived, Harry discovers he alone remembers the truth of that night. Gifted with a forbidden power to bend fate itself, he works from the shadows, rewriting destiny, manipulating events, and sacrificing everything to protect the brother who never knew the danger stalking him. But before we start, if you want more stuffs like this, then please support to subscribe this channel and share with your friends. Let's start the video. Why are you skipping the Yule Ball, Harry? Harry looked up from his book to find Professor McGonagall sitting across from him, somehow expectant and disapproving at the same time. They were in the staff room, Madame Pomfrey having bribed Harry yet again to attend tonight's meeting for her. "I'm returning home for Christmas," he replied. Much to James's displeasure, Uncle Remus added from beside him. "Don't you have marking to do?" Harry asked, shooting him a disgruntled look. Uncle Remus grinned and tickled Harry's nose with the end of his quill. "Disapproving of your life choices is far more entertaining." Harry swatted him away. "You're acting like I'm dropping out of Hogwarts to join the circus. And missing the Yule Ball while you're at it," Professor McGonagall said with a pointed look. "I have an appointment at St. Mungo's," Harry admitted. Uncle Remus scoffed. "On the 28th. Abandoning any pretenses of not listening in, Professor Flitwick frowned. "It's nothing serious, I hope." "Just some headaches," Harry replied with a reassuring smile. This statement, whilst true, wasn't entirely accurate. He was indeed having headaches, after all. Just really bad ones that could no longer be alleviated with a headache cure. He'd been having them off and on since summer, but they'd become progressively worse since November. "You're too stressed," Professor Sprout said. "I dare say a night of frivolity would be good for you." Stress had very little to do with it, truth be told. According to Madame Pomfrey, the pain was most likely caused by the cursed scar on his forehead. After several weeks of careful study, she declared it too far outside her area of expertise and set up an appointment with one of St. Mungo's curse specialists. She had pulled a lot of strings to get him in so quickly, and Harry wasn't about to miss it. Especially if it offered him some relief from the headaches. "There must be another day for your appointment, surely," Professor McGonagall said, head nodding along in agreement. "The Yule Ball is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to attend." "Not before Easter," Harry replied. "This isn't something I can put off." "We're not saying you should, Harry," Uncle Remus said. "I am more than happy to take you home the day after the ball. Or James could meet you in Hogsmeade. Hoping the train isn't your only option here." Harry groaned in defeat, burying his face in his hands. What's it matter anyway? Uncle Remus gave him a sympathetic pat on the back. "We just hate to see you miss out on more than you already have." It was an unfortunate side effect of Harry's apprenticeship. He wasn't enrolled in Hogwarts traditional classes, so he always felt a bit disconnected from his peers. Even now, he felt more comfortable being harassed about his personal life by his former professors than sitting in the middle of the Slytherin common room. "You deserve a night of fun," Professor McGonagall added. Harry looked at her from between his fingers. "Is this your convoluted way of asking me to be your date, Professor?" Professor McGonagall looked torn between laughing and scolding him for his cheek. "And steal you from your many admirers? I would never." Other than Cordelia Gamp, Harry wasn't entirely sure who these admirers were supposed to be. "Well, if you won't accompany me, I can't think of who else I'd go with." "What about Ginny?" Uncle Remus said. "Miss Weasley is already attending with Neville Longbottom," Professor Sprout offered almost apologetically. Something akin to betrayal stabbed in his gut, although he wasn't entirely sure why. It's not like Ginny had known Harry would change his plans and ask her to the ball. And if she hadn't accepted Longbottom's invitation, she wouldn't have been able to attend at all. He didn't own Ginny. She was allowed to have other friends, and yet. Pushing his feelings aside for future examination, Harry asked, "How long do I have to decide?" Professor McGonagall gave him a warm smile. "You'll stay? Only if you promise to save me a dance." She rolled her eyes good-naturedly, although her reply was cut short by the arrival of Professor Dumbledore, wearing velvet robes in a festive crimson, and Professor Moody, who dropped heavily into the chair on Harry's other side. Harry arranged his belongings to make room for him, but Moody plucked a book off the top of Harry's stack before he could cram them back into his bag. How to Start a Pandemic Without Really Trying, Moody read aloud. With one eye trained on the cover, he gave Harry a suspicious cross-eyed glare. Interesting reading you've got here, Harry. There was a jolt of uneasy bafflement at the sound of his given name. Sure, it wasn't uncommon for the other professors to call him Harry, but they'd known him for years. Moody had met him once at the Magical Library of England and never spoken to him again. He hadn't so much as mentioned looking into cursed object-induced possession as he had promised, and after so many months, Harry thought it would be too awkward to bring it up. With a tight-lipped smile, Harry took his book back. I've got an exam on infectious diseases next week. The awkward moment was broken, or perhaps increased, by Professor Snape, who said in a somewhat bland and mocking tone, "As fascinating as all of this is, might I suggest we begin our meeting?" The staff meeting commenced with little fanfare. The main topic of discussion centered around patrols and chaperone rotations during the Yule Ball. Harry's presence was largely unnecessary other than passing along Madame Pomfrey's concerns regarding alcohol poisoning and teenage pregnancy. The following morning, Harry arrived at the Great Hall far earlier than he usually would. Gnome Luna liked to arrive before all of the good bananas were gone. He found her at the Ravenclaw table, scrutinizing the fruit bowl, and dropped onto the bench across from her. "Good morning, Harry Potter," she said dreamily. "Were the Nochnitsa causing you problems again?" Harry was so used to Luna's bizarre creatures that he didn't even blink at the question. "Not this time," he replied. Luna briefly searched his face before letting out a slight hum and returning to her original task. Finally selecting a suitable banana, she peeled it and reached for the Marmite. "You're not usually up this early. I assumed you've been having nightmares again." Harry blinked, momentarily thrown for a loop. He had been having a lot of nightmares lately, ever since the World Cup, actually, but he hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Mainly because he couldn't remember them after jerking awake in the dead of night, with only that lingering, indistinct feeling of unease that informed him that he had had a bad dream. "Actually, I wanted to speak with you," he said, steering the conversation towards safer topics. She hummed around a mouthful of Marmite-covered banana. "You're staying at the castle for Christmas break, right? Daddy's on an expedition in Chile at the moment," she explained with a serene smile. "He's searching for a Dominguez. It's a massive fish-like creature whose blood has healing properties. Would you like him to send along his findings? It might be helpful for the hospital wing." That's all right." She nodded. "That's probably for the best, I suppose. It's poisonous to redheads." "We do seem to have a lot of those at Hogwarts," Harry agreed. Luna nodded thoughtfully and went back to her banana. "If you're staying at Hogwarts for Christmas, you'll be here for the Yule Ball," Harry said. "Yes. Ginny's already agreed to take pictures for me," she replied. There wasn't a hint of jealousy in her voice at the prospect that she was the only one of their friend group who wasn't attending. Then again, it probably hadn't occurred to Luna to be jealous. "Would you like to go?" Harry asked before he lost his nerve. "With me, I mean?" Luna froze, her silvery eyes flicking up at him with suspicion. "Why?" "Professor McGonagall won't stop harassing me about skipping it," he admitted. "And I figured that since you're my only other friend not going." Luna pursed her lips and set her banana down on her plate. "I don't want to date you," she said bluntly. Alarm jolted through Harry at her blunt declaration. "Oh no. That's not, as friends Luna. I don't want a date." The effect was instantaneous. The stern look vanished, replaced with pure joy. "I would love to go to the Yule Ball as your friend, Harry Potter." Although he hadn't expected her to turn his invitation down, he was relieved nonetheless. "I'll let McGonagall know." "I'll have to find dress robes," she said. "I've never been to a ball before. Certainly not with a friend." "I can't say I have either." He laughed, and their conversation drifted to their upcoming day. Their friends trickled into the Great Hall slowly, joining them at the Ravenclaw table in various states of sleepiness. Ginny predictably scowled at everyone before she finished her morning tea, particularly Cedric, the token morning person in their group. Still, Even she managed to smile when Luna proudly exclaimed how she and Harry were going to the Yule Ball, as friends, together. At least until Grace arrived. "I need your help," Grace hissed, squeezing between Harry and Ginny. Cedric looked torn between concerned and hurt that Grace had neglected to keep him good morning. "What's up?" he asked. It was then that Harry noticed that Grace was wearing a pair of mittens, which looked strangely deflated on her hands. "I might have ked up," Grace admitted in a low voice, shooting cautious looks to their closest neighbors, clearly checking to make sure that they weren't eavesdropping. Deciding it was safe, she lifted her hands to her face and pulled her mittens off with her teeth. Harry let out a startled giggle before slapping his hands over his mouth. He thought his reaction was understandable. "Shut up," she growled, trying, and failing, to stuff her hands-turned paws back in the mittens. Harry stopped her and bent over to inspect the damage. He recognized the strawberry bee-owned fur instantly. "Were you trying to change into your fox?" he asked, mildly concerned. Mishaps like this weren't uncommon the first few times an animagus attempted their animal form. They were nearly as common for someone who had completed the transformation a year ago. "I was playing around with it," she admitted sullenly, "after I saw Crumb at the first task." Harry nodded in understanding. He probably would have done the same thing if he had the free time. Whilst not particularly useful, the ability to hold two different forms was an impressive feat of concentration and magical control. "You really shouldn't mess around like this without someone around to help." He drew out his wand and gave her paws a little tap, frowning when they didn't revert to their original state. "When did you do this?" "Last night." His head snapped up in disbelief. "You spent the night like this?" That would explain why he couldn't easily undo the transformation. Much like a stain on the front of your robes. The longer a botched self-transfiguration was left to set, the harder it was to undo. "Grace, your room is right down the corridor from mine. Why didn't you come and get me?" "Well, I couldn't exactly open my door, could I?" she snapped. "I don't have opposable thumbs." "I let her out this morning," Teddy explained helpfully. He had taken Grace's usual spot beside Cedric and watched their interaction with undisguised and unrepentant glee. Grace raised her right paw as if to perform a rude hand gesture, only to remember that she no longer had any fingers. She settled for a nasty glare. Harry sighed and rammed the last of his toast into his mouth before standing up. "To the hospital wing with you." "Can't you just fix it right now? It's going to take a while. I can do it here if you'd like, but people will notice." She scowled but nodded, clambering to her feet. The tips of her paws peeked out from her sleeves, and Harry paused to ram them back into her mittens. "We'll see you at lunch," Harry said, waving to their friends before ushering Grace out of the Great Hall. They were halfway up the grand staircase when someone called out his name. He turned to find Maya, surrounded by her admirers, marching into the entrance hall. "Breakfast is this way," she called out. "Join us." Harry offered her a tight smile. "I'll sit with you at lunch," he promised. He gently pushed Grace to keep moving, only to find he couldn't. A glance down showed that his legs had been transfigured into marble. The counter spell was easy enough to perform, but Harry was annoyed that his cousin had been able to pull off such a stunt in the first place. Years of harassment and bullying had taught him to be far more aware of his surroundings. "I asked you to join me," Maya said in that slow, deliberate way that made her orders sound like a suggestion. With even, graceful steps, she glided up the staircase until she came to stop in front of them, a single eyebrow raised, allowing him to recant his rejection. His chest tightened with irritation, and it took every bit of willpower not to snap back at his cousin. Instead, he focused on regaining control of his legs. "I really can't right now. We're a bit busy at the moment." "You're never too busy for family," Maya chided in a falsely sweet voice. From down below, the Durmstrang delegation nodded in agreement. Harry tried not to roll his eyes, and Snape accused him of having a gang of followers. "Duty calls, I'm afraid," Harry replied, finally breaking the transfiguration. He pressed a firm hand to Grace's shoulder, ushering her on. "I'll see." "You're being rude, cousin," Maya said, her pleasant expression, fake as it was, melting away. Underneath, Harry caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating. Aside to Maya he decided he didn't like one bit. "I want you to eat breakfast with us." He said no. Grace snapped, speaking at last. You've got an entire crowd to appeal to your vanities. Might I suggest choosing one of them? Maya's face, which was so much like his own, twisted into a dark scowl. Her hazel eyes at last flicked towards Grace. I see you're injured, little lamb, she cooed. With reflexes Harry didn't know she possessed, Maya whipped out her wand and shot a spell at Grace, who stumbled directly into her waiting arms. What's this? She asked, ripping the glove off and exposing Grace's paw. I'd heard you were a mudblood, but I didn't realize you were a literal animal. Harry leapt forward and managed to wrestle Grace moments before she sank her vulpine teeth into Maya's arm. Go, Harry commanded, pointing in the general direction of the hospital wing. I'll catch up. He didn't wait to see if Grace had complied before rounding back on Maya. What the hell is wrong with you? Harry hissed. Maya had the audacity to roll her eyes. You're so melodramatic. I don't even know why I bother with you. Harry's blood thundered in his ears. He drew his wand. Stay away from her. Maya's eyes widened with delight. Are you turning to violence, Healer Potter? She asked in a sing-song voice. Harry, Grace murmured, and he jumped when he felt a furry paw on his hand. She's not worth it. On the contrary, Maya said with a saccharine smile. I'm worth far more than you. Hardly, Harry snapped. You're a disgrace to your family. Maya let out a tittering laugh before correcting, our family. Harry paused, his eyes narrowing as he weighed her and found her wanting. If this is how Aganas acts, I'm proud to be called Potter. He didn't stick around to see her reaction. Spinning on his heel, Harry grabbed Grace by the elbow and marched her up the staircase. They made it to the hospital wing without further delay. Harry spent the next several hours reversing Grace's botched transformation. We need to go to Snape, Harry said as he worked. Grace rolled her eyes. And what is he supposed to do about it? Well, we've got to do something about her, Harry snapped. She can't get away with this. She called me a few mean names. They're nothing I haven't heard before. Calling someone a mudblood wasn't the same as calling someone a mean name, and they both knew it. Harry couldn't even chalk Maya's use of it up to a cultural difference or blame it on the language barrier. Maya knew precisely what she was saying when she used that foul word. The only thing Harry didn't understand was why. Granted, he had only met his cousin a few months ago, but she had never given him any indications of being a blood supremacist. Unless she had, and he had somehow missed it. Pursing his lips, Harry tried to recall every interaction he'd had with his cousin. Had there been a time when she had shown her true colors? What had been his reaction? And what did it say about him if he continued associating with her? As if she could read his thoughts, Grace sighed. You don't get it, do you? Her question brought Harry up short. Get what? Grace gave him a look that was somewhere between pitying and exasperated. I wasn't the one she wanted to hurt. Maya's hostile behavior was yet another stress Harry did not need in his life. Whilst it had been relatively harmless this time, he knew that there was always a possibility that it could escalate. She might even go after his other friends. Although Cedric could defend himself against Maya, the same could not be said for Teddy, Ginny, Grace, and Luna. As talented as his friends were, Maya benefited from several more years of schooling than his younger friends. It was this realization that spurred Harry and Cedric to get creative. What if they stick together? A safety in numbers sort of thing? Cedric asked a few days later. It was the last day of classes before the Christmas holidays, and they were holed up in Slytherin's study whilst their friends attended lessons. Harry himself was done for the year, having taken his step test the day before, and Cedric's herbology lesson had been cancelled because Professor Sprout's crop of mandrakes caught laryngitis. It's hardly practical, Harry pointed out. Besides, we can hardly find Luna on the best of days. But what if we ask the portraits to keep an eye on? Cedric was shaking his head before Harry could finish. It will be too late by the time they locate us. Besides, there are too many places where there aren't any portraits. All Maya has to do is corner them in a classroom. If she hurts them there, we might not know for hours. Harry let out an angry sigh. What we need is a way to track her. They could avoid a run-in if they knew she was nearby. Cedric froze, his gray eyes wide. The map. It took Harry a moment to realize what he was referring to, and he swore under his breath. We're so stupid. They leapt out of their seats and scurried over to the table Cedric had claimed as his own. There, buried under dozens of books and notes, they found the Marauders' map. Or, at least, their rendition, considering Snape still had the original. It was incomplete, as the spells needed to create it had been too advanced for them in years past, and this year, with the tournament and Harry's tests, neither of them had had the time to work on it. But even without pinpointing the location of everyone in the castle, it was still a functional map of Hogwarts. In Harry's humble opinion, it was even better than the original, with its addition of rooms that Harry's father and uncles had never discovered. "What if we made one for each of us?" Harry asked as he inspected the map. Cedric hummed and consulted his notes. "I can't foresee it being a problem so long as we do it before the charms are applied. According to Uncle Sirius, the duplication charm interacts with one of the tracking charms, causes the entire map to sing." It was fortunate Harry had a break from the hospital wing because, over the next week, Harry and Cedric spent every waking moment on the map. They rarely left the study except to shower and attend to their prefect duties, not even to sleep. One would think that, with the term he'd had, jumping straight into a complex project would be the last thing he'd want to do. However, this could not be further from the truth. There was something invigorating about collaborating with Cedric on their harebrained scheme, and he found that he enjoyed the creative outlet it provided. And when their friends gathered around their maps several days later, Harry felt immense satisfaction for completing the project. "So we can see anyone on the map?" Ginny asked, her voice hushed with awe. Harry hummed in confirmation and ran his finger along his until he spotted John tucked safely away in Gryffindor Tower. "The charm is tied to the Hall of Pillars," Harry explained absent-mindedly. "The founders carved thousands of runes into each pillar, creating the enchantments that protect the school. My dad and one of his friends managed to sneak in back in the 70s and add runes that can sense any being's essence within the castle." "Was it Uncle Sirius or Remus?" asked Grace. Harry froze as something hot squirmed in the pit of his stomach. "No, someone else," he replied in a tone that invited no further discussion. Thankfully, the conversation moved to safer topics, although they didn't linger in the study as long as they usually would. It was Christmas Eve, and although the Yule Ball wouldn't take place until the following evening, Grace had claimed that they needed to get their beauty sleep. "Especially you, Harry," she jibed. "We can't have you looking like that next to Luna." Luna scrutinized him as their friends laughed at his expense. "You probably should do something about the hair, Harry," she agreed solemnly. "The Krampus won't like that it's uncombed." Harry nodded like he knew what the hell she was talking about. "I'll do my best." Harry grudgingly admitted that Professor McGonagall was right to bully him into attending the Yule Ball. Not that he'd ever say this to her, of course. Still, even if it weren't for the company of his friends, he was excited to see the Great Hall decorated so spectacularly. Snow fell from the ceiling, enchanted to feel warm when it landed on them. Garlands of ivy and holly hung overhead, with little jars of fairy lights casting a warm glow over the hundreds of round tables, each seating a dozen students. Harry and his friends claimed one such table near the middle of the hall, with the exception of Grace and Cedric, who were forced to sit at the front of the Great Hall with the tournament organizers. "Is that your brother?" Harry asked Ginny as they sat down for dinner. She was sitting on his right, and Neville Longbottom, her date, sat on her other side, looking awkward and uncomfortable in his own skin. "Probably. I have loads of them," she said flippantly. She tossed her hair over her shoulder, sending a waft of her floral shampoo in Harry's direction. He playfully elbowed her in the side. "Why is Percy here?" Ginny craned around, frowning when she spotted her older brother sitting with the tournament organizers. Unlike Ginny's faded green dress robes, Percy's were a sharp, if perhaps a little bland, charcoal and clearly new. "Haven't the foggiest." He never said anything. "Granted, it's not like we exchange letters very often, but," she pursed her lips in thought. "Should I stand on my chair and wave enthusiastically at him?" "It might embarrass him," Harry replied. "Is that a yes?" "Please don't," Longbottom cut in. Ginny glared, and Harry intervened before she could lay into him. "He still works for Barty Crouch, right?" "And loving every second of it," Ginny replied with an eye roll. "At least Crouch calls him by the right name now." "Barty Crouch is notorious for sending prank letters to people," Luna added casually. She had removed her butterbeer cork necklace for the night and instead wore a crown of woven spruce boughs, complete with pine cones and little paper birds charmed to chirp periodically. Sitting on Harry's left side in her cranberry-colored robes, she looked very festive indeed. He uses the pseudonym Roger Pack, but everyone knows it's him. Harry, who had only briefly met Barty Crouch, knew instantly that this statement was ludicrous. Even if Luna wasn't prone to spewing conspiracy theories, one look at Barty Crouch informed anyone with half a working brain cell that he was the last person on Earth ever to send a prank letter. Still, he diplomatically gave her a tight smile and replied, "He doesn't seem like the type." Luna gave him a stern look. "Don't judge him for it, Harry. We all have our hobbies." The arrival of dinner saved Harry from formulating a reply. The meal was pleasant, if perhaps a touch awkward, although Harry thought that might have had something to do with the addition of Longbottom and Daphne Greengrass, Ginny and Teddy's dates. Longbottom couldn't relax enough to join in on their conversations, stuttering and blushing whenever anyone looked at him for more than a few seconds, and Greengrass. She wasn't a mean girl by any stretch of the imagination, just intense. Greengrass spent most of the evening watching everyone with a shrewd eye, rarely adding anything to the conversation, and speaking only when directly addressed. Unlike her charismatic and gregarious younger sister, Daphne had a habit of fading into the background of any social situation she found herself in, content to observe the goings-on rather than partake in them. In fact, Harry could have easily forgotten that Daphne existed if it weren't for said younger sister, who chattered his ear off during her weekly checkups. Stilted dinner conversations aside, the meal itself was good. But even more enjoyable was when the tables were cleared away, and the champions took to the dance floor. The tournament organizers had somehow managed to get the weird sisters to play, and Harry watched with glee as Cedric attempted to lead Grace through a basic waltz. He knew he should have felt bad for laughing, but watching Grace dance reminded Harry greatly of the time John had put socks on his three-legged cat, Wobbles. Her movements were oddly jerky, and despite her musical inclinations, Grace seemed to lack any sense of internal beat. She trod on Cedric's toes so many times that he abandoned all attempts to lead her and placed her on the tops of his feet instead. "Please tell me you know how to dance, Luna," Harry asked when other couples joined the champions on the dance floor. Luna smiled and took his hand. "Of course," she said in her airy voice. "It solves most of the world's problems, after all." She said this with such decisiveness that Harry couldn't help but agree. They danced several more sets together before Cedric insisted they swap partners, and Harry had to endure the menace that was Grace's two left feet. He tried to distract himself by watching the other dancers, spying John dancing enthusiastically with Parvati Patil, Ron scowling in the corner as he glared at Hermione, Ginny forcing Percy to dance with her, and Longbottom, who hovered awkwardly at the edge of the dance floor, desperately wanting to partake but not knowing how to find a partner. When the song was over, Harry happily returned Grace to Cedric before hunting down McGonagall for the dance she had promised. From there, he danced with the Ravenclaw seeker Cho Chang, a fifth-year Hufflepuff called Owens, Katie Bell, much to George Weasley's ire, several sets with Ginny, and, inexplicably, Daphne Greengrass. "Are you having an enjoyable evening, Greengrass?" Harry asked after a full minute of silence. She shrugged. "It's better than going with Malfoy." "Oh, do you not like him?" "Nobody likes him," she replied blandly. "Even if I found him tolerable, it's not worth being shunned over." Harry closed his eyes as he attempted to comprehend her words. Why would you be shunned for going to a dance with Malfoy? He glanced around the great hall until he found the boy in question standing in a corner with Crabbe and Goyle. Greengrass gave him a look he couldn't interpret. "Anyone caught talking to him gets shunned," she explained slowly, as if he were a toddler. "When did this start?" Harry asked. With all his tests this year, he hadn't had time to keep up with the Hogwarts rumor mill. She shrugged again. "October, maybe? Did you really not know what you started?" He gave her an incredulous look. "What I started?" Greengrass watched him for a moment, cataloging his reaction. Fascinating. She didn't elaborate further, and Harry was only partially glad when the song ended and she drifted off, in a daze. Harry wandered off in the other direction, finding himself at the refreshment table without any recollection as to how he got there. Greengrass's words echoed through his head on a loop, but try as he might, he couldn't make sense of them. To his knowledge, he'd never told anyone to shun Malfoy. The closest he got was advising John and their collective friends to ignore him, but that was hardly the same thing. Unless, you look pensive, Potter. Harry turned to find Percy Weasley beside him, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the ball. After all we've been through, I think you can call me Harry, he said. Percy jerked his chin down. Only if you call me Percy. I don't have a choice in a crowd this size, Harry teased. I'd end up summoning half the school if I used your surname. Percy rolled his eyes but didn't seem all too offended. How have you been? I keep myself busy, Harry replied lightly. With those exams, Percy added. Ginny was telling me about them. Harry shrugged. Honesty? They're probably the least of my worries at the moment, what with, well. You didn't come to the ball to listen to me complain, he said with a little self-deprecating laugh. No offense, but why are you here? Mr. Crouch sent me, Percy explained, his chest puffing up with pride. He's been under the weather lately. I've been standing in for him in the meantime. Admittedly, he'd hardly spoken to the man, but that didn't sound like the Bartemius Crouch that Harry knew. It's nothing serious, I hope? Not at all, he said in a rush, almost as a reflex. But even as he said it, something flickered across Percy's face. He glanced over his shoulder. Well, nothing officially. I really shouldn't say anything, but... You're worried? Harry guessed. He's been rather confused, I suppose. It's the oddest thing. We'll have a conversation one day, and the next, he'll deny it ever happened. Harry pursed his lips and motioned for Percy to follow. They slipped out of the warmth of the great hall and out onto the chilly grounds. Paths had been cut into the ankle-deep snow, and they followed one into the rose garden, which someone had decorated with hundreds of fairy lights and carved ice sculptures. Have there been any other symptoms? Harry asked quietly. They were alone at the moment, but in a place like Hogwarts, there was always a risk of being overheard. Percy let out a heavy sigh and considered the question. Sometimes his words don't make sense. He'll speak in English, but the way he says it makes it impossible to understand him. Harry thought he understood what Percy was explaining. John did it sometimes when he imposed English words on Greek grammar. How many languages does Crouch speak? 200. That would do it, Harry thought. The symptoms particularly made sense in light of this information. There was only one way to learn that many languages. He's a hatter. Percy jolted and gave Harry a panicked look. It's not widely known, he said, confirming Harry's suspicions. It's not illegal, Harry replied, although he understood Percy's desire for secrecy. Hatters were people who overused thinking caps, magically enhanced hats that allowed the wearer to learn anything to a high level of proficiency in a matter of hours. And whilst this sounded all well and good, the use of thinking caps was not without any risks. Wearing too many caps too close together could scramble someone's brain. You think he's abusing them? Barty Crouch, pompous bastard that he was, seemed like the type. He probably used a few and got cocky. Possibly, Percy sighed as if he desperately wanted to be wrong but knew he wasn't. The symptoms fit, only I haven't seen him using them. He could be wearing them at home, Harry pointed out. Have you told anyone? Percy let out a mirthless laugh. Who would I go to? Mr. Crouch is the head of the department, and I can hardly make an appointment with the minister. Maybe you should, Harry said. Just to get it on the record. Merlin forbid something happen, but if it did, people would wonder how you didn't notice. I know, Percy gave him a sideways look. I've never heard anyone say it like that. Harry frowned, confused. Like what? Percy watched him for a long moment. You're nothing like I thought. I'm sorry. Harry apologized, not sure if he should feel offended by the statement. He shook his head. Don't be. They wandered along one of the paths, each lost in their thoughts. May I pick your brain on something? Harry asked after some time. Percy nodded, half eager, half self-importantly, and waved for Harry to continue. What do you know about the Muggle-Born Protection Act? Harry asked. Percy rattled off a long list of legal jargon that Harry couldn't parse. When at last he exhausted himself, Harry continued. Did you know that British Muggleborns are required to attend Hogwarts? I should think so, Percy said pompously. We've got a statute of secrecy to uphold, and we can't have untrained children running around and ruining that. I don't disagree, It's just, Harry pursed his lips as he considered his next words before shaking his head. Never mind, it's not important. Harry felt something brush against his elbow, and when he looked over, he found the sanctimonious expression had melted off Percy's face. What troubles you? Harry shook his head. It's nothing. I don't want to burden you with it. Something flickered in Percy's light blue eyes that reminded Harry of Marcus. I wouldn't have asked otherwise. Harry let out a slow breath. It's just, I've got this patient, a Muggleborn, and she desperately wants to leave Hogwarts. She says she doesn't feel safe here, and after the events of the last 3 years, I can't say I blame her. Percy frowned. Could she not enroll in a correspondence course? That was the first thing I suggested. But the law explicitly states that Hogwarts is the only place for Muggleborns to learn magic, and failure to do so results in the removal of the child from the home, with the parents' memories modified. Percy finished. Harry watched as the pieces clicked into place for Percy. Surely, you must have misinterpreted this law. If I have, then so has Dumbledore. My patient practically begged him to be let out, Harry said. I dunno, it just seems unfair. Percy supplied. Harry nodded. Especially because dozens of wizarding families elect for private tutoring. Why are they permitted to homeschool their children but not Muggles? Percy tilted his head as he considered this. I suppose that the point of the law is to ensure that Muggleborns are given a premier education. Even if they don't want it, why wouldn't they? The incredulous tone of Percy's voice rankled Harry in a way he couldn't quite articulate. I would suppose it has something to do with this world. Some people discriminate against them, and they're tossed into a culture they don't understand and expected to conform. They might even have plans for their life that have nothing to do with magic. Percy gave Harry a disbelieving look. Why would they care about those things when they could have magic? Because the Muggle world is interesting, too, Harry explained. My friend is a Muggleborn, and she showed me some of her mother's old medical texts. Did you know that Muggles are 18% more dense than Magicals? And their immune system is way more robust than ours. The things Muggles can survive that would kill a wizard. You sound like my father, Percy noted with dry amusement. Is that such a bad thing? Harry asked. Muggles are fascinating. And the things they've learned, did you know they've been to the moon? Like, a man actually stood on the moon. My patient told me she wants to be the first person to go to Mars. Magicals can't leave Earth, Percy pointed out. Our bodies can't withstand the force of gravity it would experience if we tried to leave the atmosphere. It's a well-known fact. I know, Harry conceded. I've already explained why going to Mars would be bad for her, but that doesn't change the fact that this was a dream for her. A dream that's been crushed because she can't learn about the necessary things an astronaut needs to know. The closest she'll ever get to Mars is by looking at it through a telescope. Percy sighed and stopped walking. Why are you telling me this? It's just that, this law, it doesn't consider that Muggleborns might not want to uproot their lives to join our world. Shouldn't they be given a choice? They need to learn to control their magic, Percy said. It's a security risk if they don't. But why Hogwarts? Why are they forced to come here when wizarding families aren't? Why are they given the luxury of choice, but the same can't be afforded to Muggleborns? Practicing magic is dangerous. Hogwarts is the safest place to learn. There are other schools, day schools that don't require boarding. There are private tutors that are equipped to fix any accidents. Harry let out a sigh and shook his head. This law seems like it disproportionately affects Muggleborns. Percy's tone was harsh, and a muscle twitched in his jaw as he stared out over the Black Lake. After a moment, he added sarcastically, the name does suggest that it would. I'm sure you know the law better than I, Harry said after a moment. Maybe I have misinterpreted it. It's no secret that my father doesn't support this law, so perhaps that's colored my understanding of it. The law is supposed to promote greater equality for Muggleborns in the wizarding world, Percy said. On paper, perhaps it accomplishes that, Harry said. Percy nodded. Equality isn't the same as fairness, he conceded. I'd never considered it. They continued their walk through the grounds in silence. What do you want from me? Percy asked. Harry blinked in surprise. What do you mean? Percy gave him a calculated look. I must inform you that I am only Mr. Crouch's assistant. We work in the Department of International Magical Cooperation. The Muggleborn Protection Act has nothing to do with my division. I know. Harry broke off before grabbing Percy by the arm. Merlin, did you think I brought you out here to convince you to overturn the law? Percy raised an eyebrow. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. Harry shook his head. I'm fully aware that you have no power here, Harry said, trying to keep his voice calm. I'm not here to convince you of anything. Then what do you want? Percy asked, his face twisting into a scowl resembling Mrs. Weasley's. Harry shrugged. I just want to help my patient. And you think I'm the one to do it? Mate, I'm asking for advice here. You were head boy. I figured you would know how to. Harry broke off, his expression shuddering. You know what? Forget it. I'm sorry for pulling you away from the ball. Harry, let's go back inside. It's cold. He spun on his heel and started towards the castle. He made it 10 feet before Percy seized his arm and forced him to turn around. What do you need, Harry? Percy asked. His voice had lost the hard, suspicious edge from before, and for the second time that evening, Harry was reminded of Marcus. The sight of the earnest, fraternal expression made Harry's chest ache. I don't know, Harry replied. Yes, you do, Percy insisted, gently squeezing his shoulder. Just ask me. Harry shook his head. That's just the thing. I don't know. I've got about a million other things I need to do, and everyone keeps expecting me to fix their problems. You're empathetic and competent. Of course people are going to come to you. I'm exhausted, stressed, and can't even fix my own problems. It certainly doesn't seem like that to the rest of us, Percy said. Especially not with your brother running around, singing your praises. Harry filed this away for later contemplation and redirected the conversation. But I haven't the foggiest on what the hell I'm doing, he admitted. What do I do? Percy released a heavy sigh and looked out across the snow-covered grounds. They stood in the snowy rose garden for quite some time, Percy's hands still gripping Harry's arms. Harry waited on bated breath, his heart pounding in his chest, as Percy thought. You want my advice? He asked at last, inclining his head towards Harry. Harry nodded his head. Please. Go back inside and enjoy the rest of your night. Then, you're going to bed and get a good night's rest. Harry rolled his eyes, but it seemed that Percy wasn't done. Then you're going to put away your books and notes for the rest of the holidays and spend time with your friends and family. And eat something too. You look like you've lost at least a stone since August. I meant, what do I do about my patient? Harry clarified. If he wanted to be mothered, he would have gone to Remus or Cedric. You do nothing, Percy said simply. You focus on passing your exams and spending time with your friends. You're in over your head with this Muggle-born Protection Act. Harry's heart plummeted to his shoes. I can't just. Meanwhile, Percy said, raising his voice, I will look into this. Percy, no, you're busy enough as it is. I can't ask you. You're not asking. I'm telling you what's happening, as clearly, you can't do it alone. I will look into this matter with your patient. I don't. If you didn't want me to help, you shouldn't have asked me anything, Percy explained. The pompousness was back in his voice, but something in his eyes gave Harry pause. Percy wasn't offering because he thought Harry was correct and this law was unfair. He was offering because Harry had asked. Now, let's go back inside. You're right. It's entirely too cold out tonight to linger outside for long. With a warm hand on Harry's shoulder, he led him back towards the castle, where joyous laughter and lively music wafted across the grounds, golden light cutting across the dark courtyard. And as they walked, Harry couldn't decide if he felt more horrified or ashamed by how easy it had been to manipulate Percy Weasley. Judging by the fact you've been ignoring our owls, I think it is safe to say that the appointment didn't go well. Harry startled, sending the book in his lap tumbling to the floor. He twisted in his seat and found Marcus hovering in the doorway of the library. Harry, who had never seen Marcus wear anything other than black or gray, thought the crimson robes he wore looked oddly out of place. What are you doing here? He gasped. Marcus arched an unimpressed eyebrow. Checking up on you, he drawled. Seeing as you're incapable of long-distance communication. I thought you were visiting Wood's family in Scotland, Harry corrected. He summoned his book, checking it over for any dents. It was undamaged, but he continued to fiddle with it as he avoided Marcus's eyes. Came back early. Right, Harry muttered. There was an awkward beat of silence before Harry remembered his manners. Won't you sit? Marcus sidled further into the room and lowered himself into the chair across from Harry's. Harry retook his seat and called for Acorn to bring tea. The appointment? Marcus prompted once the house elf had disappeared. Harry fiddled with his fingers as he recalled the healer's words. There's nothing they could do for me. Marcus frowned. They couldn't find anything wrong? Harry shook his head. No, he took a shuddering breath. They think it's a parasite. In my scar. He pointed needlessly to his forehead, where the tip of his jagged scar peeked out from beneath his fringe. But they can remove it, right? Marcus asked, his brow furrowed. They tried. I nearly leveled St. Mungo's. Harry closed his eyes and tried to will himself calm. The pain had been indescribable, and he'd blacked out 3 seconds into the procedure. But before he'd let loose such a powerful wave of accidental magic that the hospital had shaken. He'd later found out they'd had to evacuate the hospital to check its structural integrity. Marcus let out a low whistle. You don't do anything in halves, do you? Harry gave him a half-hearted shrug and looked away. He knew Marcus was trying to lighten the situation, but he wished he wouldn't. Outbursts of accidental magic at his age were humiliating. So what now? They said the parasite wasn't hurting me, so they elected to leave it. Except it is hurting you, Marcus insisted. You've been having headaches for how long? Too long, Harry said. Dad's taking me to the Asclepian for a second opinion. Good. When? June, once term ends. Marcus gave him an incredulous look. You're going to put up with debilitating headaches for another 6 months? With my tests, there really isn't a good time. That's a load of shite, and you know it, Marcus snapped, crossing his arms across his chest. You could take those in your sleep. You flatter me, but... Marcus didn't wait for him to finish. What's the real reason? He waited for Harry to reply, who pursed his lips and looked away. Is this some sort of self-sabotage? Or have you found some new flaw in the universe you've decided is your fault and need to punish yourself for? Harry scowled. That's not it. Then what is it? Harry threw his hands up in the air. They're not going to find anything, are they? Yeah, you're right. The best healers in the world will take one look at your scar and toss in the towel. I'm serious, Harry snapped. They won't find anything because I won't be able to tell them what happened that night. Why not? Harry threw him a dirty look. You know why. Whenever I try to talk about it, my voice. He waved his hand as if to say, well, you know. Because he did. Everyone knew about Harry's mute episodes. They'd become less frequent over the years, but trying to talk about that infamous Halloween was a guaranteed way to trigger one. The healers didn't even bother to ask me this time. They knew it was useless. I was useless, Harry almost added, disgust crawling through his veins like a venomous spider. He stood abruptly and moved to one of the windows that overlooked the western grounds of Potter Manor. His father and Uncle Sirius were walking through the garden, their heads bowed low. Whilst he couldn't be entirely sure what they were discussing so intently, he could hazard a guess it had something to do with him. Their conversations invariably turned to him on days like this, after something happened to him and he fell silent, and his father had no idea what to do with him. He hated that he was so paralyzed by his fears that he robbed himself of the choice to speak, because that was what he really wanted. A choice. He wanted to be able to keep secrets, not be forced to keep silent. Why couldn't he just be brave? He wanted desperately to tell someone what happened that night, if only so he didn't have to bear this secret alone. But he wasn't really alone, was he? Whispered a small voice inside of him, because there was someone who knew, someone he'd told, however incompletely. She'd kept his secret and had never changed how she acted around him or thought differently about him. True, he hadn't meant to tell Ginny his secret, but he had, hadn't he? And if he'd done it then, maybe he could do it again. Voldemort gave me the scar. When Harry's throat seized, and it felt as if he were trying to swallow 1,000 hot rocks. He didn't try to kill my brother. Marcus had risen at some point during Harry's agonizing and moved to stand behind him. In the window's reflection, Harry could see Marcus's lips part in surprise, his brow furrowing in confusion. I don't understand. Harry took a deep, shuddering breath, his throat seizing as if his body were trying to keep this secret locked away. The scared, traumatized little boy trapped inside his body tried to convince him there was still time to take it all back, to remain silent. But the Harry he was now, he didn't want to stay silent anymore. His silence had never served him. It didn't protect him from anything, it only hurt him. John's not the one who survived the killing curse, Harry managed to whisper. I did. Harry tensed, waiting for the inevitable questions. The hows he couldn't give and the whys he didn't want to. Maybe there would be accusations that he was lying or simply misremembering. As if such a thing were possible. Harry wanted nothing more than to forget. But that didn't happen. Instead, Marcus placed a warm hand on his shoulder and gently turned him around. You're the boy who lived, he said. Harry wished he could deny it, and he had tried for many years. He'd tried to convince himself that maybe Voldemort hadn't hit him with the killing curse, that he'd missed, or Harry had merely thought he'd been hit when really the curse had hit John, who had been cradled in his arms. I can't believe I didn't, Marcus said. You're boggart. It was all but announced in the middle of the Great Hall. And all this time, no one knew. Voldemort knows that it's me, Harry admitted. For the first time, doubt crept into Marcus's expression. Voldemort's dead, Harry. He's not. Not really, Harry disagreed. It was as if a dam had broken open, and now that the truth was trickling out, he couldn't stop. I fought him in my 3rd year. He explained the events that went down in the Death Maze and how Professor Quirrell had hosted Voldemort's soul for the entire year. As he spoke, Marcus's face lost more and more of its color. By the time he'd finished, Marcus looked ready to faint. I don't know what to say, Marcus said, covering his mouth with one of his hands. The others don't know. Ginny knows some of it, Harry admitted. I didn't plan on telling her, but... You need to tell them, Marcus insisted. When Harry began to protest, he held up a hand. I'm serious, Harry, they need to know. It's not like they can do anything about it. That's not the point, he snapped. You can't keep these things to yourself. At least tell Cedric. But Harry was already shaking his head. Ced's got enough on his plate with the tournament. The last thing he needs is this dumped on him. He'll want to know, Marcus said, although Harry could see his resolve wavering. As much as Cedric tried not to show it, everyone could see the pressure was getting to him. Between what he considered his subpar performance in the first task and his increased popularity, Cedric was as stressed as Harry had ever seen him. Still, there was truth to Marcus's words. Cedric would want to know even if he couldn't help in any way. Maybe after the tournament, Harry compromised. Marcus clearly wanted to disagree, but he settled on a disapproving scowl. And what are we going to do in the meantime? I don't know, Harry said. He hadn't been lying when he said he wouldn't have time to visit the Asclepion before June. Suffer, I suppose. Marcus looked ready to throttle him. Dispense the Theatrix, he snapped. So you can't visit the Asclepion until June. But what about that bloke? Rodriguez. What about him? Write to him, Marcus said as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. Ask him for his opinion. Something hot and panicky squirmed in Harry's gut. I wouldn't even know what to say. Then it's a good thing I'm here, isn't it? Marcus asked. He placed a hand on Harry's neck and steered him towards Harry's pile of books, locating a spare bit of parchment within the mess. Grab a quill. We've got a letter to send. 2 weeks later, Harry was back at Hogwarts. He still hadn't heard from Rodriguez, but Harry honestly wasn't expecting to for quite some time. When he wasn't at the Asclepion, Rodriguez lived with his family in Texas. It would take ages for Hedwig to reach him, let alone return with a reply. In the meantime, Harry tried to bury himself in his studies and keep Cedric alive. As he had most days since returning, Harry was holed up with his friends in the Hogwarts library, desperately searching for a way for Cedric to breathe underwater for an hour. Just use gillyweed, Harry said, briefly looking up from his notes on aconite poisoning. It feels like cheating, Cedric repeated for the millionth time since Harry had first suggested it. The bubble-headed charm isn't designed to withstand the pressure found at the bottom of the Black Lake, Harry said, trying yet again to steer Cedric away from this harebrained scheme. He nodded to the piles of arithmetical equations where Cedric had spent the better part of a month trying to improve the bubble-head charm. I don't doubt you could do it, but I don't think you should be taking this risk when a much safer option is readily available. Here's a better idea, Grace interjected. You steal the Durmstrang ship. What? Cedric spluttered. Grace nodded, a mischievous gleam in her eye. Think about it. It can travel underwater. How else do you think the Durmstrang delegation got here? That is terrible idea. They all jumped and spun in their seats, only to find Victor Crumb scowling at them from the end of the herbology section. Grace recovered first and stuck her nose up in the air. "You're just jealous that I thought of it first," she replied breezily. Crumb's brow furrowed even further, and he stomped towards their table. "Only Headmaster Karkaroff can." He trailed off as he searched for the correct word. Unable to produce it, he said it in Bulgarian before finishing, "Ship. It is connect to his ring." "Okay, new plan," Grace said. "We knock out Karkaroff, nick his ring, and then steal the ship." "She's joking, of course," Teddy interjected at Crumb's thunderous expression. "We're not going to steal the ship." "Maybe you won't," Grace said. "Maybe I want a magical ship for myself." "Perhaps for your birthday, love," Harry replied. "Would you like to join us, Victor?" Cedric asked, redirecting the conversation. To their immense surprise, Crumb accepted the invitation. Harry scrabbled to move his books and notes to give him room. "Have you figured out what you're going to do for the next task?" Grace asked as she twirled her quill between her fingers. "You can't ask him that," Teddy hissed under his breath. In an effort not to stare, he had pretended to return to his Transfiguration essay. Still, Harry noticed that the reference book he had picked up was upside down. "Why not?" she asked. "Ced's already got it figured out." "That's cheating," Teddy insisted. "Since when have you ever cared about cheating?" she teased, sticking the feathered end of her quill in his ear. "I highly doubt he's got plans to steal Cedric's idea," Harry said diplomatically, summoning Grace's quill when Teddy started to hit her with his book. "If anything, Crumb should be worried about Cedric stealing his." "I am not worried," Crumb said in a monotone. "You've got it all worked out, then?" Cedric asked curiously. Crumb nodded. "I will be swimming." Everyone at the table froze. "Swimming?" Harry choked out, glancing at his friends. You do know what the clue meant, right?" "Something will be stolen and hidden in Merperson Village in Lake," Crumb said, sounding bored. "I will swim and retrieve." "Mate," Cedric said slowly, his face twisted in concern. "The lake's 300 meters deep in some parts." "And the task is in February," Grace added. "The water will be ice cold." Crumb nodded. "Yes." They stared blankly at him, unable to comprehend the insanity they were hearing. Even Cedric's bubblehead charm sounded brilliant. Are you sure you don't want to steal my plans?" Cedric asked. "I don't mind." "Or steal the Durmstrang ship," Grace added. "I will live," Crumb said decisively. With a curt nod, he stood from the table and stomped back down the aisles of books, stopping to give Cedric a blank look. "Use gillyweed. It is safer." He didn't wait for them to respond before disappearing into the depths of the library. After several moments of stunned silence, Harry turned to Cedric. "I hate to say I told you so, but..." Cedric refrained from hexing Harry. Barely. But in the end, he accepted the advice, and a month later, he swallowed a clump of gillyweed before diving into the Black Lake. Harry wasn't sure what the tournament organizers were thinking when they planned the second task, because watching the Black Lake for an hour in the cold Scottish February wasn't exactly Harry's idea of fun. Unlike the first task, there was no way to watch the champions once they disappeared beneath the water, which had to be boring for the audience. For him and Madame Pomfrey, it was a terrifying experience. The two of them stood on a floating platform erected in the middle of the lake, ready to assist when the champions emerged from the water. Although they hoped they wouldn't need it, the platform was also stocked with medical supplies for anything that could go wrong, from a cracked tooth to cardiac arrest. "I hate this," Harry said as he glanced at the smooth, dark water. Of the three champions, Harry was the least terrified for Cedric. Gillyweed was at least relatively safe. The bubblehead charm Dealcore used less so. Still, it was a right side better than Crumb, who had taken several deep breaths, transfigured his feet into flippers, and dove straight into the icy water. "If there's a problem at 100 meters, we won't get to them in time." "I can't believe I'm saying this, but believe I am missing the dragons right now," Madame Pomfrey agreed. They sat in tense silence, dividing their attention between the parchment with the champion's vitals and the map of the Black Lake. Harry had considered using his map but thought better of it when he remembered Snape would be in attendance and would no doubt confiscate the new and improved version faster than he had the original map. Instead, Harry had gone to Flitwick for assistance in creating a tracking system for the champions. 2 weeks later, they had a map of the lake, and Flitwick thought Harry was a verifiable genius. How's he still alive? Madame Pomfrey mused, watching the parchment with Crumb's vitals. They watched in horrified awe as he steadily swam deeper into the lake, already deeper than Cedric and Delacour combined. He's going to reach the bottom soon, Harry noted before glancing at his watch. If he keeps this up, he'll have finished the challenge in 5 minutes. Harry's predictions proved accurate, and 4 minutes and 32 seconds later, Crumb's head broke the surface, a dazed and shivering Hermione Granger at his side. For his part, Crumb looked rather bored as he helped Hermione onto the platform and only accepted a blanket from Madame Pomfrey because she threw it over his shoulders. "Okay, I was wrong. That was incredible," Harry said as he gave Crumb a quick once-over. Unlike Hermione, whose teeth chattered behind purple lips, Crumb seemed largely unaffected by his plunge into the lake. Harry supposed it had something to do with Durmstrang's location up north because his diagnostic charms didn't register any sort of warming spell on him. "What must your lung capacity look like?" 8 liters, Crumb replied, his tone monotonous. "I can hold my breath for 15 minutes underwater." "Merlin," Harry gasped. "And here I thought the animagus thing was incredible." Crumb watched him for a moment. "Not Quidditch?" "Oh, well, that too, I suppose," Harry said with a sheepish grin. "You're very odd," Crumb replied after another pause. "I've been called much worse," Harry said with a smile. "Anyway, that's you done. You're free to return to the shore." He pointed his wand at the water and conjured a small wooden boat for Crumb and Hermione to clamber into. Once they were seated, he rapped the side of the boat and sent it zooming across the water. "Perhaps with less speed next time, Harry," Madame Pomfrey replied. "Crumb's a Quidditch star. I'm sure he's loving it. And Miss Granger?" Judging by the piercing shrieks, Hermione was less enthusiastic. "She'll be fine." Madame Pomfrey raised an unimpressed eyebrow and hummed in disapproval but didn't comment. With no more patience, they returned to watching the other champions descent. The next half-hour felt like an eternity. Harry was almost too afraid to blink lest he miss something critical. "Delacour's heart rate is increasing," Madame Pomfrey noted. "She's sustained a shallow laceration on her right arm." Harry wished there was a way to charm the lake clear, if he could just see. "Sustained laceration to her back. Respiration is elevated. Reckon she's being attacked?" Harry asked, rolling his wand between his fingers. "A Grindylow, if I had to guess," Madame Pomfrey agreed. "She's not very deep, and if she decided to swim through a kelp forest." "And now that blood's been drawn, more will come," Harry added, his jaw clenching. This was really not good. If they were going to extract Delacour from the competition, they needed to do it now. "She's about 20 meters west of us," Harry estimated, consulting the map. Madame Pomfrey pursed her lips. "We best be ready." Harry nodded and conjured another boat. His heart was pounding as he stepped inside and charmed it to glide to hover over Delacour. Whilst he waited for Madame Pomfrey's signal, he transfigured his shoes into flippers, applied every warming charm he knew, and cast a bubblehead of his own. And then a blast as loud as a cannon sounded across the lake, and Harry dove. The plunge into the Black Lake in late February was about as miserable as one would expect. Even with the warming charms, it felt as if 1,000 knives were stabbing into Harry's skin. It was hard to focus on anything other than the pain as he swam, the water growing colder and darker with each kick that propelled him deeper. He reached the kelp forest and sent a blast of air at it to clear his way. Even still, long, slimy tendrils wrapped around his ankles, making descending all the more difficult. He heard the Grindylows before he saw them, their high-pitched shrieks echoing eerily through the water. Even in the darkness, Harry could see their sickly green bodies swarming on something. Merlin, there had to be 100 of them, Harry thought as he aimed his wand at the mass, sending a jet of hot water at the Grindylows. They shrieked in fury and retreated to the safety of the kelp. Harry knew they wouldn't stay away for long, but it bought him enough time to reach Delacour. She was unconscious, her silvery hair casting a ghostly glow on her lax face and the nearby kelp. Without the weight of the Grindylows dragging her down, she began to rise in the water, and Harry only had to reach out his hand to grab her arm. After reapplying her bubble head, Harry kicked upwards, dragging them both towards the surface. He cast more revulsion jinxes behind him as he went, hoping the hot water would keep the Grindylows at bay. After nearly cracking his skull on the bottom of his boat, Harry broke the surface. Delacour's head lulled, and he levitated her into the boat, a trickle of water escaping from her gaping mouth. Wrapping the boat with his wand, he propelled it towards the platform even faster than Crumbs had left it. He would have liked to be in it with her, but time was of the essence, and he wasn't sure if he could clamber into the boat without tipping it over. Instead, he endured the freezing swim back to the platform, where Madame Pomfrey was already working on Delacour. Delacour looked no better dry than she did wet, and her skin was ashen as Madame Pomfrey attempted to clear her lungs of water. "Dry yourself off," Madame Pomfrey commanded as he hauled himself onto the platform. "We'll need to re-establish sinus rhythm." He did as instructed before kneeling on Delacour's other side. Over the next several minutes, they worked in tandem to resuscitate Delacour, their movements silent and precise, an efficient machine after years of working together. Harry had never been so relieved to have someone cough several lungfuls of water in his face when Delacour's icy blue eyes snapped open. "Welcome back," Harry replied dryly, summoning a warm blanket and covering her. Delacour's eyes rolled in their sockets, her gaze glassy. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a painful-sounding croak managed to escape. "You were attacked by Grindylows," Harry explained as he lifted her onto a stretcher. The disoriented look slowly receded from Delacour's eyes as awareness began to creep back in. "Gabrielle," she managed to croak after several failed attempts at speech. "Ma sir." Harry didn't speak French, but even he could understand her words. After all, Harry had been the one to place Gabrielle Delacour in an enchanted sleep at 6 that morning. "Your sister is safe," he promised. Delacour continued to babble in unintelligible French as Harry levitated her stretcher and pushed her into the medical tent. The tent was blissfully warm and empty, except for Medusa, who was curled inside a drawer full of bandages. "Her lungs are wet," Medusa noted as Harry transferred Delacour into a bed. She slid out of her drawer and landed on the floor with a dull thump before slithering to his side. Harry paused his work to pick her up so she could see better. "What do you suggest?" Medusa wound her way to his shoulders and inspected the scene. "The burn will set in soon," she explained, her tongue flicking against the shell of his ear. "Infection," Harry translated with a distracted nod. Delacour must still have water in her lungs. Summoning his potions kit, Harry set to work brewing a ghost potion, the nightmarish cousin of the pepper-up potion. Unlike the pepper-up, which required 3 habanero peppers, the ghost potion earned its reputation with the sickening inclusion of 14 ghost peppers. For obvious reasons, the ghost potion was not to be used lightly, especially if a pepper-up would work. Unfortunately for Delacour, the standard pepper-up wouldn't do. Because of her near drowning, lake water had settled deep in her lungs. They'd managed to clear enough of it so she could breathe, but the rest would need to be cleared out to prevent pneumonia. Hence, the ghost potion. "I won't lie to you. This will hurt like hell," Harry informed her as he siphoned a dosage into a flask. "Breathing out will help." Delacour gave him no indication that she could understand him, but she accepted the potion just the same. Harry knew the exact moment the potion began to work because Delacour screeched and let out a string of French profanities. Hot steam billowed from her nostrils, ears, and mouth like a grotesque kettle, and when she grabbed his arm, her nails dug in deep enough to draw blood. He allowed it, knowing his pain was only a fraction of what she was experiencing. Keeping breathing, he gently reminded her when her body tensed up and curled in on itself in a desperate attempt to escape the pain. It was a tough 7 minutes as the potion worked its way through her body. By the end, Delacour's skin was pink and steaming, her face tear-stained and dripping with snot. Harry conjured a handkerchief for her and gave her a moment to collect herself whilst he cleaned up. "My sister," Delacour croaked. "She will die." Harry paused, halfway through scrubbing his cauldron. "Gabrielle will be fine," he insisted. "Z-egg," Delacour began, tears welling in her eyes once more. Harry abandoned his cleaning to move to her bedside. Taking her hand, he tried to give her a comforting smile. "Wasn't meant to be taken literally," he explained. "Professor Dumbledore is eccentric, but he's not cruel. Your sister will be perfectly fine." "I failed her." Harry considered reassuring her but knew she'd see his words as false platitudes. No words could ease her self-appointed shame, which went deeper than a bad score in a competition. If the situations were reversed, and he had been the one to fail to rescue John, Harry knew he'd never forgive himself. It was the principle of the matter, the deeply ingrained role of an older sibling to protect the younger, no matter the cost. "Do better next time," Harry said, squeezing her hand. Delacour gasped. Hurt, fury, heartbreak, shame, and a dozen other emotions flickered across her face before it settled on understanding. She nodded slowly. Harry released her hand and returned to his duties, making sure to keep an ear out for trouble. When Cedric returned with Grace 10 minutes later, the second task of the tournament concluded. Points were awarded. Crumb's 50 points secured his spot in first place despite his unconventional methods. Cedric was in second place, earning 47 points for his admirable performance. "Zay should have given me 0, Delacour spat when the judges awarded her 25 points, putting her in third place. "Think of it this way," Harry said dryly, "it makes up for being low-scored in the first task." Delacour glared at him. "You are an awful boy. You're a miserable girl," he said with a cheeky grin. Harry couldn't be sure, but he thought he saw a hint of a smile play at the edge of her lips. Or maybe it was just her expression relaxing as two mermaids pushed an unharmed Gabrielle Delacour out of the water. In the coming days, Cedric would begin preparations for the final task, and Harry would no doubt assist when he wasn't revising for his exams. The next 4 months would fly by, and so too would his 6th year at Hogwarts. He had books to read, essays to write, patients to care for, and unjust laws to look into. He still wasn't sleeping well, and his headaches were only increasing in frequency and intensity. Still, with the champions safe and relatively unharmed, Harry allowed himself to relax, at least for a little while. "Is that Hedwig?" Teddy asked. Harry craned his neck, searching the hundreds of owls swooping into the great hall. Sure enough, he located the familiar snowy owl amongst them, carrying a wooden crate with the aid of 2 other owls. The sight of her produced mixed feelings. As much as he missed his owl, which he hadn't seen since December, the fact that she was finally returning after all these months could only mean one thing. Rodriguez had finally replied to his letter, and sent a care package, by the looks of it. The owls landed with a heavy thud in the middle of the Slytherin table, upsetting his pumpkin juice into Ginny's lap and showering nearby students with an assortment of breakfast foods. Blaise Zabini, in particular, looked rather miffed as he pulled bits of egg from his hair. Up close, Harry could see why 3 owls were needed to deliver the crate, as it was large enough for Grace to comfortably fit inside. The wood was bulging, and if it hadn't been for the feather light charm and rune-anchored expansion charms placed over it, Harry was sure the crate wouldn't have made the journey to Scotland. With trembling hands, Harry helped untangle their talons from the thick ropes that had been tied around the crate in a desperate attempt to hold it together. Once they had been freed of their load, the 2 owls let out pitiful hoots and flew away. Hedwig watched them go with a judgmental look before relocating to Harry's shoulder. Harry spared a moment to rub his thumb between her eyes and offer her a piece of toast, then turned his attention towards the crate. Several dozen books were inside, written in various languages, or so he assumed, judging by the few spines visible to him. The books were jammed so tightly inside the crate he struggled to free them. A thick envelope bearing his name lay on top, written in Rodriguez's hand. "What did you get?" Teddy asked, leaning over to peer inside the crate. Harry caught Teddy's nose between his thumb and forefinger and gently pushed him back. "Nose out," he chided, reaching for the letter. Teddy frowned. "You're not stopping Ginny." Grace scoffed. "Of course he's not. It's Ginny." "What's that supposed to mean?" Harry asked. "Oh, nothing," Grace said with feigned innocence. "Just that she could tell you she's murdered someone, and you'd blame the victim before helping her bury the body." "Don't be ridiculous." His response amused Grace for some reason, and she shared a look he couldn't interpret with Cedric. Suddenly embarrassed, Harry tore open the letter and extracted several sheets of parchment. "Dear Harry, thank you so much for reaching out to me. I can only imagine how difficult that letter was for you to write, and I appreciate the trust you've placed in me. I apologize for the tardiness of my letter. Your question sent me on something of a wild goose chase. And I would know because Phoenix stole Marta's wand last month and managed to transfigure herself into a goose. She spent 3 days honking and being a menace to society before we managed to turn her back. Not that the kid didn't put up a fight. I think she enjoyed being a goose a little too much because we keep having to fish her out of the garden pond. But I digress. The symptoms you described in relation to your scar are concerning, although not unheard of. As I'm sure you know, it's not uncommon for cursed scars to cause pain. For instance, a vampire's changed scar will actually incinerate them if they betray their coven. See pg 703 of Confessions of a Canadian Coven. Intrigued, Harry dug around in the bulging crate before locating the book in question. A little square of yellow paper was sticking out of the top, marking the page. Is that in French? Teddy asked, peering over his shoulder. I think so, Harry said, his statement coming out more as a question. Can you read it? Teddy gave him an affronted look, as if Harry had suggested he swallow a live toad. Why would I? Because you're a rich bastard with a rich bastard's education? Grace suggested. I'm English, Teddy said, sticking his nose imperiously into the air. If you wanted a translation, might I suggest speaking to Malfoy? I'm not that desperate, Harry said. You could always ask one of the Beauxbatons lot, Cedric pointed out. Delacour's English is actually pretty good. Harry glanced across the great hall, easily spotting Delacour's silvery hair amongst the Ravenclaws. She was bent low over a book, twirling her wand between her fingers as she read. Unlike Cedric, who struggled to escape his fan club and rarely made it through a meal uninterrupted, the only other person sitting near Delacour was her little sister, who was half asleep as she spooned fruit into her porridge. I don't think she's particularly well liked by the others, Cedric explained in a low voice. Oh no. Grace practically shouted. She pointed an accusing finger at Harry. The last thing we need is a French pet. If you need a translation, you can use a charm. She's not a stray dog, Grace, Harry admonished, batting her hand away. Hang on, I thought you liked Delacour, Ginny said. Last week, you rescued her from McLaggen. Grace shot Ginny a betrayed look. Yeah, well, it was McLaggen. Frog-eater or not, no one deserves that. You asked for her hair routine, Ginny reminded her. Grace flushed s. Arlette. Come off it. How could I not? Her hair is stunning. Amusing as their squabbling was, Harry returned his attention to the book, which, as it would turn out, wasn't the only book written in a foreign language. In his spare time, Rodriguez had tracked down a staggering 58 books pertaining to cursed scars, marked the applicable passages, adding translations when necessary, and provided his thoughts on the material and how it might help Harry's case. Rodriguez had dozens of theories, although he admitted that he couldn't be sure without examining Harry in person. The fact that you remember Voldemort casting the killing curse is where a lot of my theories fall apart, though. If it weren't for that, I would have diagnosed you as the victim of a blood adoption. At least a botched one. You look too much like your daddy for it to have been performed correctly. But still, this feels like it's got ritual magic all over it. I know I dumped a lot on you all at once, but read through these books when you get a moment. See if anything sounds familiar. I disagree with your healer's findings that nothing can be done here. We just have to keep looking. Thank you again for trusting me with this, Harry. I haven't had this much fun researching since I had a patient in 72 who could only rap limericks in Navajo. Yours in health, River Rodriguez. Harry had mixed feelings as he finished the letter. On one hand, he was extraordinarily grateful to have Rodriguez's support. On the other, it was hard not to feel disappointed that he still had no answers after all this time. Just theories and a mountain of reading to add to his insane workload. But busy or not, Harry was a bit of a swot at heart. Rummaging around in the crate, Harry took inventory of the books. They were grouped together in terms of category and, within that, organized by order of importance, then color. He pulled out a stack Rodriguez had labeled, Non-Magical Degenerative Brain Disorders, which consisted mainly of thick Muggle medical textbooks. It's possible that the killing curse fried your brain cells, resulting in brain damage. That would explain the persistent headaches. No mice have extensively studied the phenomenon, usually as a result of blunt force trauma. I suppose it's possible the killing curse had the same effect. A warm hand touched his elbow, and Harry nearly leapt out of his skin. Are you all right? Ginny asked, lips pursed in concern. You're shaking. Harry shoved the note and stack of books back into the crate, his heart pounding somewhere around his esophagus, and gave her a stiff nod. He cleared his throat. Yeah, just. What's all this for? Teddy asked in a strained voice, as if physically holding himself back from snatching the letter and reading it himself. Grace managed to drag her gaze away from the crate long enough to give Teddy a mocking look. You don't know? She asked before mimicking Teddy's. That's not how visions work. Cedric watched Grace and Teddy squabble for a moment, a fond smile tugging on his lips, before turning back to Harry, raising a brow as if to ask, "Want to talk about it?" He did. Desperately. But Harry could think of about 15 different reasons why he shouldn't, and so he forced a smile on his face and said, "It's nothing. Just something for a patient." He could tell Cedric didn't believe him, but he was kind enough to drop the subject. Checking his watch, Harry decided he had just enough time to deposit Rodriguez's present in his chambers before he needed to be at the hospital wing. His friends offered to accompany him, but Harry waved them off, wanting a few minutes alone with his thoughts. Not that he got a chance, of course. Barely 10 steps out of the Great Hall, he collided with someone, knocking them both to the ground. The strained expansion charms failed in a spectacular cataclysm that sent heavy books raining down on their heads. Harry muttered a few choice words and threw his hands up to shield himself. "Sorry about that. I didn't see you," Harry said when the assault was over, only for his heart to leap to his throat when he realized who he'd plowed down. Clearly, Victor Krum replied with a scowl, which turned into a grimace as he massaged his wrist. Brilliant. He'd broken Bulgaria's Starseeker. "Here, allow me," he said, motioning with one hand for Krum's wrist whilst the other fumbled to pull his hood over his head. Krum complied without hesitation. "A mild sprain," Harry explained as he palpated the wrist. "May I heal you?" At Krum's unenthusiastic grunt, Harry focused on the inflammation within the connective tissue and the red-hot pulse of magic just beneath the surface of Krum's skin. Krum gasped in surprise as Harry's magic sank into his arm, a sensation Harry knew from experience felt like icy water swirling through the veins. The scent of eucalyptus perfumed the air, and the space around them crackled with static electricity. "Do that again," Medusa commanded, poking her head out of Harry's bag. Her tongue flicked through the air, and her red eyes glittered with excitement. "It tastes good." "He's already been healed," Harry pointed out. "Break him again." Harry rolled his eyes and shoved her back into his bag. "How did you do that?" Krum demanded, flexing his mended wrist. A sly smile tugged at Harry's lips. "Just a little trick I picked up." He'd been developing the charm for a few months, inspired by Medusa's descriptions of healing magic. In theory, if he could sense the breaks in the body, the parts where magic's path was not as seamless as it should be, he could impose his magic into the break and heal the wound. In practice, it had been a lot harder to actualize, namely because he couldn't go around testing an unauthorized healing spell on his patients. Harry had ended up sacrificing a lot of toes to the cause. There were limits to the spell, as there always were with magic. He'd never attempted on a compound fracture, but a sprained wrist like Krum's? That he could do. In fact, it was almost thrilling, feeling the thrum of magic pulsing between him and the break. Medusa liked it too, judging by her giddy reactions whenever he'd used it, so it was a win-win situation. His reply did nothing to satisfy Krum. "This is not Asclepian magic." He was correct, although Harry was surprised Krum knew it. Whilst the Asclepian was hardly a secret in the magical world, there were so few Parselmouths that most wizards went their entire lives without meeting an Esculapian healer. The best place to meet one, in fact, was at the Asclepian itself. The fact that Krum could recognize their magic suggested that he'd spent significant time in Epidaurus. Considering Bulgaria's excellent hospitals, Harry had to wonder what had brought Krum to the Asclepian. Harry bit the inside of his cheek to keep himself from prying. "I read a lot," Harry said, keeping his tone polite but subtly ending the conversation. Unfortunately, he must have been too subtle because Krum pushed anyway. "You perform without wand." "It's the only way to do it," Harry replied evasively. With Krum healed, Harry turned his attention to the dozens of books scattered around the entrance hall and began gathering them up, pausing when he came across a journal filled with sketches of magical creatures. "Is this yours?" Krum snatched the journal back and pressed it to his chest. Instead of responding, he watched Harry with narrowed, distrustful eyes. "Did you draw them?" Harry asked. They're quite good. Charcoal, right? My brother likes to draw with it. Yes. I have seen. Simultaneously delighted that the taciturn Bulgarian was willingly conversing and baffled by the turn in the conversation, he asked, "You've seen John's art?" John learned to draw from his fellow fourth-year Gryffindor, Dean Thomas, a few years ago. Although Harry strongly suspected that the interest had initially lain with the teacher, John quickly learned he had an aptitude for art. He'd recently started experimenting with magical portraiture, although he hadn't yet allowed Harry to see his handiwork. In his studio, Krum explained with a nod, on floor 7. "You've been?" Harry asked, unable to disguise the jealousy in his voice. Harry knew of the studio's existence. Between the map and Uncle Remus's love of gossip, it wasn't hard to find its location, but John was adamant that Harry stay away. He had never given a reason, but Harry supposed it had something to do with having a space separate from family. Considering Harry had the study, he could hardly begrudge his brother for wanting the same. Still, it rankled him to know there were places he wasn't allowed to go, to know that Krum, a stranger, was granted access over him, John's own family. Either electing to ignore Harry's sour mood or simply not picking up on it, with Krum, you could never be sure. He nodded and said, "Hermione showed me." He went to the Yule Ball with her. Harry's temper pulsed when he caught Krum's flinch at the sound of Maya's voice. Slowly, he turned to face his cousin. "May I help you with something?" Maya raised an eyebrow at his carefully controlled tone. "Yes, you're in my way." Harry glanced around the entrance hall. Whilst a few of his books were scattered across the stone floor, neither they nor he was impeding her movements. "Hardly. Unless you wish me to lay palm fronds on the ground? I prefer fine Persian rugs, actually." Extracting her wand, she gave it a little flick and conjured a long floor runner in a brilliant blue. It cut a path between the great hall and the great oak doors that led to the grounds, and Maya strutted down it like a queen on coronation day. It was a flashy bit of magic, and had Harry not been so annoyed, he might have laughed. He wished Maya wasn't so awful. She really could be funny. With her humor and flair for the dramatic, she reminded him a lot of his father, actually. "Oh, and cousin mine?" Maya said. She didn't turn fully to address him, merely tilting her head to glance at him over her shoulder. "You should keep better track of your correspondence." "What are you on about?" Harry snapped. Maya smiled with too many teeth. Reaching into her robes, she produced a thick bundle of parchment, which she dropped casually from 2 fingers like it was nothing more than a soiled rag. Harry summoned it before it hit the ground. His blood ran cold. "You wouldn't want that to fall into the wrong hands." Ears ringing, Harry didn't notice that Maya had swanned off, because in his numb hands was Rodriguez's letter. In the days that followed, Harry waited for Maya to do something. Under the best circumstances, Maya was never one to let something go, but with their argument, Harry had a legitimate fear of retribution. In the vaguest of terms, Harry informed his friends of what had transpired in the entrance hall and told them to be cautious in their movements. "I think we should tell someone," Cedric said a few days after the incident. It was during one of the rare occasions where their schedules aligned, with neither boy having lessons or duties to attend to. They had elected to spend their free time wandering around the empty corridors, Cedric appreciating the novelty of moving freely about the castle without a crowd of admirers dogging his every step. "It's a family matter," Harry grunted. "The last thing I want." This stopped being a family matter the moment Maya broke Gracie's wrist. Cedric snapped. The uncharacteristic display of anger brought Harry up short, and shame flooded his body. Cedric was right, of course. The problem with his cousin had spiraled out of control. Just yesterday, Maya and a few of her friends had chased Teddy down 3 corridors before he managed to give them the slip. Nothing had happened so far, due entirely to the maps, but Harry knew it was only a matter of time before she caught one of them off guard. Harry closed his eyes. "I know. I'm sorry. You've developed a distrust of authority figures over the years. I get it. None of the staff ever stepped in to protect you, but Harry, Maya isn't going to stop." He flinched at the tough honesty. "I know," he whispered. "I need to tell someone, I just." "What about McGonagall? She's a friend of your dad's, right?" "Even if she tried to help, what could she do?" Harry asked, anxiety thrumming in his ears. Abruptly, he turned away and strode to a nearby window, looking across the grounds. A Care of Magical Creatures lesson was taking place, and Harry watched with clinical detachment as some poor sod was dragged across the lawn by one of Hagrid's blast-ended Scroots. "Talk to Dumbledore. Get her kicked out of Hogwarts," Cedric suggested. "I'm sure once they know what she's been doing, they'll take some sort of action against her." When Harry didn't respond, Cedric touched his elbow. "You're afraid of her," Cedric said quietly. "Yes," Harry admitted through numb lips. "Why? Tell him." Harry wasn't sure if it was the memory of Marcus or his own conscious whispering in the back of his mind. He tried to shake it from his mind. Cedric didn't need Harry's worry on top of everything happening. He's already worried. As if sensing his traitorous thoughts, Cedric forced Harry to look at him, his gray eyes wide with earnest concern. And then, before he could stop himself, words were tumbling out of his mouth. "She read my letter." Cedric mouthed the words, his brow wrinkled with confusion. "From that American healer?" At Harry's minute nod, Cedric pressed his lips together. Harry could practically see his brain working as he attempted to decipher Harry's words. "Is she blackmailing you?" "I don't know," Harry admitted in barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how much she read or understood, but—" Cedric released a shaky huff and ran a hand through his dark hair. He leaned against the stone wall and watched Harry through narrowed, scrutinizing eyes. "And you're worried about patient confidentiality?" he asked. But as soon as he said it, his head cocked to the side. "Only I know you. You wouldn't write a letter that would give away a patient's identity." "No," Harry agreed. "Tell him. Tell him, tell him, tell him." His heart thundered so hard in his chest that it was hard to breathe. "It was for me," Harry admitted. There was a painful, pregnant pause as Cedric absorbed the meaning of Harry's words. "It's the headaches, isn't it?" When Harry nodded, Cedric sighed and shifted his weight, pressing his shoulder to Harry's in a silent show of support. "How bad is it?" "It could be worse." "So bad," Cedric translated. "Do you want to talk about it?" "It's nothing to worry about," Harry said. "I was worried already," Cedric pointed out. "At least this way, I can be worried with you." Despite the gravity of the situation, a smile quirked at Harry's lips. "You should focus on surviving the tournament." "I think you meant to say, winning," Cedric corrected with an unimpressed eyebrow. "Course I did." Cedric nudged him in the ribs before grinning. "Seeing as you're electing to protect my delicate senses from whatever ails you, will you tell me after?" So accustomed to secrecy, his gut reaction was to say no, but he had promised Marcus. "Bring me the Triwizard Cup, and we'll talk." Cedric let out a whoop of delight and thumped Harry on the back. "Good man. That's the support I need from Potter." Harry jumped, crashing sideways into Cedric. Without thinking, his wand was in his hands, and he pointed it down the corridor just as Professor Moody stomped into view. "Put that thing away, boy, before you put someone's eye out," Moody growled. Behind him, Cedric gave Harry's elbow a supportive squeeze. "You don't need that," Harry agreed in a light tone, hoping his trembling hands went unnoticed as he shoved his wand back into his pocket. "Although, I think I could set you right." It might have been a trick of the light hitting one of his myriad of scars, or perhaps his imagination, but did Moody smile? "I didn't come here to be flirted with." Huh. Who knew Mad Eye had a sense of humor? Probably for the best. "You're not my type." "You're as bad as your father," Moody snapped. Despite his unease at Moody's sudden appearance, Harry smiled. "Was there something you needed, sir?" "Yeah. Come with me." He didn't wait to see if Harry followed before spinning on his heel and stomping back the way he came. Confused, Harry and Cedric exchanged a look before dutifully trotting after. "Not you, Diggory," Moody said without bothering to turn around or halt his loping gait. Cedric gave the back of Moody's head an easy grin. "We're a package deal, I'm afraid," he explained in a light tone. He looped his arm around Harry's neck. "Can't have him having any fun without me." "I've been told I don't know how to have fun," Harry said dryly. "You don't," Cedric agreed. "Which is why, should the miraculous occasion occur, I need to be there for it." "Enough. Both of you, come with me." Without another word, the three of them set off again. Moody led them down a series of corridors and up several staircases. Although Moody had neglected to mention where they were going, and ignored any further attempts at small talk, there were only so many reasons a teacher would seek him out like this. Considering Harry hadn't broken any major school rules in the past year and a half, the list was considerably short and almost entirely featured his brother. The belief was only confirmed the closer they got to the 7th floor. When he heard sobbing, Harry broke away from Cedric and sprinted past Moody. John was alone in the abandoned classroom he'd claimed as his art studio, or at least, what was left of it. Oil paints were splattered around the room, and sketches were shredded. A fine black dust hung in the air, coating every flat surface in what Harry realized had once been John's charcoal. His brother stood beside an easel, which held a canvas that looked as if it had been hacked apart by a serrated knife, viciously rubbing his robe sleeve against his face as he tried to gather his ruined supplies. Harry rushed to help, trying not to grimace as charcoal clung to his white robes. "What happened?" Harry asked gently. "It was Malfoy, I know it," John snarled through his tears. He quickly launched into a hysterical rant about an encounter with Malfoy after supper yesterday, although John hadn't engaged, showing an impressive amount of willpower on his part. Even though John was leading a school-wide shunning campaign against the nasty little weasel, Malfoy still managed to occupy the vast majority of John's thoughts. Malfoy had ended the one-sided argument with the ominous, "You won't be able to ignore me for much longer, Potter." Harry had to admit the evidence, although circumstantial, was rather suspicious. There was only one small problem with it. "It wasn't him," Harry explained with a heavy sigh. "You can't know. He's in the hospital wing right now. And don't say he could have sneaked out, because he really couldn't have." Harry shuddered at the horrors he'd left behind in the hospital wing that morning. 14 Slytherins had taken ill overnight and were in the process of evacuating there. "Well, he's quite ill." "Nothing serious, I hope?" Moody asked, having arrived at last. He lingered in the doorway, each of his mismatched eyes trained on a different brother. Cedric stood behind him, looking like he'd like to come in but couldn't figure out how to politely ask their professor to move. Although baffled as to why Moody would care, Harry shook his head and replied, "So long as he stays hydrated." Hoping to redirect the conversation, he nodded towards the tattered canvas. "Is it salvageable?" John gave the painting a despondent look. "Doubt it," he whispered, no doubt in an attempt to hide how his voice cracked. "It took me ages." Harry resisted the urge to hug his brother, knowing he wouldn't appreciate the gesture in front of so many people. "May I look at it?" "Suppose it doesn't matter now," he said. "It was supposed to be your birthday present." Harry ran his hand through John's hair before peeking at the easel. His eyes widened as he took in the oil painting. "John," he breathed, "this is remarkable." It was a portrait depicting a majestic stag with rusty brown fur that shone in the sunlight. Around its hazel eyes were patches of darkened fur, giving it a bespectacled appearance. It had an impressive rack of antlers in which a tawny hare was nestled. His curiosity outweighed his politeness, and Cedric brushed past Professor Moody. "Blimey. It moves." At the moment, the stag was backed into a small patch of unmarred canvas, giving the gashes a distinctly unimpressed look. "However did you do it?" Harry asked, fascinated. He leaned in closer, and the hare's ears sprang up in alarm. Moving portraits weren't unheard of in the magical world. Indeed, all one had to do was step out into the corridor to prove it. But the charms to animate them were closely kept secrets, passed down from painter to apprentice. No two animation charms were the same, and not all were as enduring. Indeed, a trained eye could tell what art house a painting came from by how well the work moved and how long the charm lasted. John looked torn between pride and devastation. He gave them a sullen shrug. "It started moving a few weeks ago. Adding the details has been a nightmare. Nearly drove me mental. You keep sneezing every time I try to add whiskers." "You didn't use a spell?" Harry asked. John shook his head. "It's been happening a lot recently," he admitted. "If I put too much detail into something, it just sort of takes on a life of its own. Last week, I had to redraw a Botruckle diagram 3 times for my Care of Magical Creatures homework before I got one to stay put." Equal parts astonished and intrigued, Harry asked, "Have you ever tried to do it on purpose?" "No point, really. As I said, finishing the thing's a nightmare when your subjects wander off." John sighed and grabbed a nearby rag, wiping his hands as he surveyed the portrait. "I don't want to get rid of it, but..." "You could take it to Mr. Filch," Cedric suggested. At their confused stares, he went on to explain. "He's the caretaker. He might know a thing or two about restoring portraits. He's a squib, Moody pointed out. The hopeful light that had sparked in John's hazel eyes sputtered out, and Harry had to suppress a glare. And? He asked. Moody raised an eyebrow but didn't reprimand him for his waspish tone. A simple reparo would be a hell of a lot faster. John looked horrified. You can't mix reparo with this stuff, he gasped. You'll ruin the animation charm. Which we've already established you didn't use, Moody grunted, looking less patient by the second. It might be too risky to try, Cedric interjected, spreading his hands in a pacifying gesture. I reckon we should defer to the artist in this situation. Harry squeezed John's shoulder. Maybe Ced's right, he said. Talk to Filch. See if he has any ideas. John wilted and nodded glumly. He pulled the portrait off the easel and stroked the stag's cheek. I just wish I knew who did it. The stag tossed its head to expose more of its face, the force nearly sending the hair flying. At the last moment, it tangled its long limbs through the stag's antlers and fixed John with an unimpressed glare. Moody sighed and grabbed a nub of charcoal from the ground. His joints cracked audibly as he straightened and began to scribble a chain of runes around the doorway. These will keep anyone but family out of the room, he explained. What about my friends? John asked. Ever the responsible one, Cedric added. What if there's an emergency in here and professors can't get inside because it's been warded? There were spells for that. Harry wanted to explain. Madame Pomfrey had covered them ages ago, in case a patient was trapped inside of a room. But something had begun to itch at the back of his mind. No, surely not. And yet, Moody nodded at their suggestions and adapted his work. The runic chain grew increasingly complex, surpassing everything Harry learned from Professor Babbling. Energy radiated out of the carefully drawn runes, infused with so much magic that they glowed a faint amber. It was astonishing to behold, and Harry had only ever seen something like it once before, down in the Hall of Pillars. Much like the Founders, Moody was clearly a genius when it came to runic magic. What's wrong with you, boy? Moody asked suddenly without pausing from his work. He didn't turn to face him, but Harry got the impression that the question was directed at him. Nothing, Harry replied, shaking his head. His fingers prickled, and he tightened them into a fist. It's nothing. Just. Something hot twisted in his chest and seared through his veins. It felt as if he was floating outside of his body. He needed to go and find Maya. Hex something into oblivion? He wasn't sure. He just knew he needed to leave. Please excuse me. Where are you going? John asked, frowning. Harry shot Cedric a knowing look before replying. I need to speak with Maya. He tried to keep his tone light, but it sounded strangely echo-wide to his own ears. John's frown deepened. Why? Because she's an arrogant, out-of-control bully who I've left unchecked for far too long. Harry wanted to snap. Still, he held his tongue. John adored Maya, his good nature undoubtedly missing her subtle cruelty. It didn't feel right to shatter John's delusions about her. And if Harry's suspicions were correct, John would be crushed. Oh, you know, just a family thing. Then shouldn't I come too? Mate, Cedric interjected, coming to Harry's rescue. Why don't we go see Filch? It was an effective, if slightly devious, tactic, using John's mercurial moods against him. Immediately, John's body sagged, and his expression fell. With a dejected nod, John gathered the shredded painting into his arms, cradling it like one might a sleeping infant. Eyes downcast, he trudged out of the room after Cedric. I'll come with you, Moody grunted once they were gone. He carelessly tossed the charcoal to the ground and brushed his hands together. I'm done here. That won't be Ness, save it, Moody snarled. You've forgotten I was an Auror longer than you've been alive. I'm not as easily fooled as your brother. The heat in Harry's chest gave a painful thrum, and Harry fought down the urge to snap back. I have no idea what. So, you weren't going to confront your cousin about destroying? Moody waved his hand, gesturing at large to the ruined studio. When Harry clenched his jaw, Moody gave him a gnarled grin. You're not as subtle as you think you are, Harry. It's a family matter, Harry replied with a tight smile. Your presence would be inappropriate. They stared at each other, sizing each other up. After several excruciating moments, Moody's magical eye whizzed in its socket. She's on the 5th floor, Moody said. near the Muggle Studies classroom with 3 friends. Thank you, Harry muttered as he stepped around him. Don't do anything I'll need to arrest you for. It wasn't hard to find his cousin. Between his knowledge of Hogwarts's secret passageways and the fact that Maya was in no way trying to hide, he caught up with her quickly. She was indeed with 3 friends, 2 boys and a girl that Harry vaguely recognized from her posse but didn't care enough to know their names. Black clung to the beds of their nails and the hems of their robes, confirming Harry's suspicions. Maya, he hissed, the stone walls carrying his voice down the corridor. Oh, Maya said in a sing-song voice, sending her friends into a renewed set of giggles. What the hell is wrong with you? Harry asked. He tried to keep his tone low so he wouldn't disturb any lessons, but it was difficult when his heart pounded in his throat. Whatever do you mean, cousin? She asked, facing him. Her expression was one of exaggerated innocence, her eyes too wide and a toothy smirk tilting her lips. Harry took measured steps as he approached, the soles of his shoes clicking on the stone floor. Why? He asked. He stopped inches from her, looking down at her face, which looked so much like his own. Why did you do it? She smiled at him, giving off the air of a cheeky child who'd been caught sneaking a biscuit. Fury coursed through his veins, burning icy hot and stealing his breath. His fingers and toes prickled. Fine. It was going to be like that, then. This ends now, Maya, he whispered, too afraid that if he didn't, he'd shout. If you've got a problem with me, take it up with me. Leave my friends alone. Leave John out it, he's done nothing to deserve this. Maya rolled her eyes. I didn't touch your brother. No, Harry agreed, something acidic stinging his tongue. Because if you had, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Something far worse would be happening if you'd harmed him. But you're not that stupid. Maya let out a nasty, high-pitched laugh. God, you're so dramatic. Let me tell you what's going to happen, Harry said lowly, continuing as if she hadn't spoken. You're going to go out and buy John replacement supplies for everything you ruined today. Then you're going to bring them to him, and you're not going to mention that you were the one to destroy them in the first place. Maya gave him a curious look. And why would I do that? Her smile turned patronizing. Shouldn't I apologize for being so naughty? You've hurt him enough, Harry said. He doesn't need to know that his cousin is a conniving, backstabbing bi.ch on top of it. A flush turned her olive skin s. Arlette. She drew her wand and pointed it at his chest. Say that again, she snarled. Harry raised an eyebrow and tilted his head. This ends now, Maya, he repeated. Leave my friends alone. And if you so much as touch a hair on John's head, Someone was coming. Multiple people, by the sounds of it. And to Harry's horror, he knew exactly who it was. Muggles have been repairing paintings for ages without magic, Mr. Filch explained, looking far more animated than Harry had ever seen him. He held John's portrait as he led John and Cedric down the corridor. They hadn't seemed to notice them yet and were carrying on a lively conversation about 17th century portraiture. A madman knifed Rembrandts. The Night Watch, back in the 70s, but you'd never know it today. I love Rembrandt. His use of chiaroscuro is so compelling. My dad took me to the National Gallery in London, and I was utterly captivated by an old man in an armchair, John replied, trotting beside the caretaker. Harry couldn't help but roll his eyes despite the tense atmosphere. Trust his bother to befriend Filch, of all people. Maya, who had leaned around Harry's body to watch, straightened and gave him a sickeningly sweet smile. Shall we test that threat, cousin mine? And then, before he could stop her, she lunged to the side and whipped her wand towards the little group. Cedric let out an uncharacteristically foul oath as he drew his wand. Maya's overpowered blasting curse slammed into his shield charm, enveloping the small group in a wall of fire. Rage tore through Harry and, with it, his magic. It burst out of his body with enough force to hurl his cousin halfway down the corridor. The doors lining the corridor flew open one by one as they were hit with the tidal wave of magic that erupted from Harry. His robes swirled around his ankles, his hair stood on end, and his skin burned from the force of his magic. It jerked Maya to her knees, spun her around, and dragged her so that she hovered inches off the ground in front of Harry's feet. In a fluid, serpentine motion, he bent and grabbed Maya's jaw, squeezing it just tight enough to hurt. What did I just say? His words came out in a low, menacing hiss, too overcome with emotion to release the scream that thrashed in his chest. "Answer me." But still, she didn't reply, only stared up at him, eyes wide, mouth agape, face drained of color. His head gave a nasty throb, and for a moment, the world fractured and spun. Through slitted eyes, Harry glanced at his brother and hissed in God knew what language, "Are you hurt?" Safely behind Cedric's shield charm, John slowly shook his head. Good. That was good, Harry tried to tell himself. But the fury and magic writhed inside him, filled him, overflowed from him. He returned his attention to Maya, who flinched, and the smirk that twisted his face did not feel like his own. "Listen carefully because I will only say this once," he said softly. "If you ever touch a hair on my brother's head again, it will be the last thing you ever do. That is not a threat but a most solemn oath. I do not care if you are family. If I find out you've given him so much as a paper cut, I swear that you will regret the day your mother bore you." He felt detached from the words, from himself, really, as if he were watching an actor on a faraway stage. He watched Maya as she knelt at his feet, and his body hummed with satisfaction and power. "So much power. Do you understand?" he asked. Maya nodded. Her pupils were blown wide. She was terrified. This pleased him. "You've made your point, Potter." He tilted his head, glancing behind him. Maya's cronies were long gone, and in their place stood dozens of curious students, the professors long since given up on ushering them back into the classrooms. At the front stood Moody, who fixed him with an inscrutable stare. "Have I?" Harry heard himself ask. "You're scaring your brother." The haziness vanished from Harry's brain, and he glanced back at his brother, whose tanned skin had gone a sickly gray. John was scared of him? The fire in his chest sputtered out, and icy panic set in. The magic that suspended Maya dissipated, and her knees slammed into the floor with a sickening crack. Harry drew his wand and knelt before her, but she scuttled away before he could cast a diagnostic charm. Merlin. She was terrified of him. The thought was not as satisfying as it had been only moments before. Pursing his lips, he rose, glancing around at the gawking students. He tried to apologize for the disturbance, but no sound came out of his mouth. This would undoubtedly be all over the school by supper time. How Harry Potter had finally snapped. Well, Harry had no plans to stick around for it. He stepped around Maya and headed towards John. John, who was still behind Cedric's shield charm. Did Cedric think he'd hurt John too? Oh God, what had he done? He'd hurt Maya. He threatened to kill her and... Harry. Cedric caught the sleeve of Harry's robes. Harry's white healer's robes he didn't deserve to wear because he'd hurt Maya. "Harry, please. Wait." But he couldn't wait. He had to get out of there, away from the prying eyes and the hissed whispers and his cousin who'd he hurt and his brother who he could have hurt and... Magic shuddered through his body as it changed seamlessly into a hair, and before anyone could catch him, he ran. "I thought I might find you in here." Harry startled and glanced up from his book, blinking owlishly when he found Ginny standing a few feet away. Medusa let out a delighted hiss at the sight of her, slid off Harry's shoulders, and wiggled her way over like an enthusiastic golden retriever. "Love what you've done with the place," Ginny said dryly, stooping to run a finger over Medusa's head before offering her a handful of ice mice from her pocket. Medusa gave Harry a smug look before snatching one up and speeding off. Ginny straightened and continued, "It's very mad scientist chic. Much better than the whole murder dungeon from before." Harry blinked, idly wondering if Ginny was some sort of hallucination. After all, a hallucination made as much sense as her standing in the Chamber of Secrets. He'd come down here to be alone, as it was the one place that only other people who could access it would never go. As if she could read his mind, Ginny gave him a wry smile. "Cedric's going spare," she explained. She pulled a map from her pocket, giving it a little wave. "He knew you'd come down here to sulk, but for obvious reasons, he had to wait until I got out of my lesson. You can't imagine how hard it was to convince him to let me come alone." Harry could, actually. Ginny willingly descending into the chamber 2 years after her possession by Voldemort would have set off alarm bells for him, too. Last they'd spoken of the chamber, Ginny had emphatically informed him that she would be fine with never stepping foot in the place again. But now here she was, her red hair vivid even in the subterranean chamber. And though her freckles stood stark against her pale skin and her hands shook in their tightly curled fists, she was here. I'm not sulking. Ah, right, she said, sitting down beside him and pulling the book he'd been reading from his hands. Who wouldn't want to come down to the murder dungeon and read? She glanced at the cover, and her jovial facade turned to disgusted horror. Is this in Latin? Merlin, you're so dramatic. I thought it was mad scientist chic, Harry replied dully, wincing when she began to rifle through the pages. He gently took the book back from her. And this was written in 400 BC. Ginny pressed her lips together in embarrassment. What's it about? Blood adoption. Oh, that sounds horrific. Harry finished. At her hesitant nod, he continued. It's from Rodriguez. Remind me not to get on his Christmas list. A faint smile twisted his lips, and he gingerly tucked the book into his bag. Not that I'm not always thrilled to see you, but what are you doing down here? Ginny shrugged before resting her head on his shoulder. I was worried about you. The lingering pool of shame in Harry's gut flared. Brilliant, not only had he nearly killed his cousin, but he'd also made Ginny come down to her version of hell. You didn't have to come. I know, she said simply. I wanted to. As they often did, words failed Harry. He settled for taking her hand. Ginny wove her fingers through his and squeezed. It's different than I remember, Ginny said after several minutes of silence. It's almost beautiful. Compared to how it looked when she last saw it, Harry couldn't help but agree. Until a few months ago, the main hall of the chamber was flooded with putrid, ankle-deep water. He spent countless hours draining and disinfecting the place until it resembled what Slytherin had intended. Harry gestured to the chamber. This is an abaton. Think of it like an ancient Greek hospital, he explained. Slytherin was a student of the Asclepian and acted as Hogwarts' first healer. Her lips twisted into a frown. How do you know? I found his diaries in the study, Harry explained. My old English isn't great, so it's been slow translating them. But he describes his day-to-day life at the Ascol. What? She gave him an incredulous look. You found Slytherin's diaries and just read them? Well, it's not like he's around to complain about it. The bloke's been dead for a bit. No, I mean, she huffed out a laugh. Why are you hoarding them like a dragon? Shouldn't you turn them into someone? And have to explain where I found them, Harry replied before shaking his head. I don't want people stomping through the study. That's our place. Ginny nodded in concession, her eyes alight with amusement. Yeah, we'd have to hang out in the creepy abandoned hospital, and only you'd like that. You lot would abandon me, and I'd turn into the reclusive bookworm my family has always feared I'd become. We wouldn't want to ruin their hard work, she agreed, patting his knee with her free hand. So, what did these secret diaries tell you about this place? It was originally supposed to be Hogwarts' hospital wing, he explained. Ginny grimaced. And he chose a damp dungeon, why exactly? It wasn't always underground, he explained. It used to stand where the Great Hall is now. Slytherin buried the chamber not too long before he was ousted by the other founders. He was afraid Gryffindor would destroy it. The hospital wing? Why? She had twisted her body to face him fully, curious eyes wide, reminding Harry of the day they'd met. Harry ran his thumb over her knuckles while he considered his next words. By the sounds of it, Gryffindor didn't trust Slytherin's occult practices. Slytherin feared Gryffindor would destroy the Abaton, so he buried it beneath the school. And placed the basilisk to protect it, Ginny finished. Harry cringed. No, he placed the basilisk here to kill Muggle-borns. He knew that once he'd left, the other founders would invite more Muggle-borns to the school, and, well, he offered Ginny a tight smile. Look, the man was undoubtedly a genius, but he was a massive wanker. You weren't far off when you called this place a murder dungeon. She let out a slow breath and turned to survey the room again. Then why restore it at all? There was nothing accusatory in her tone. She was genuinely curious. We've got a perfectly good, above-ground hospital wing if you weren't aware. Despite the humor in her words, they were also colored by grief, as if Harry'd got her hopes up and that the events of her first year were an anomaly for this place. Part of him wanted to address the sadness, remind her that none of it had been her fault, but he held his tongue. The sight of her trauma was hardly the place to discuss it. Instead, he offered her the levity she so desperately wanted and gently bumped his shoulder against hers. I think I've heard of it. It's on the second floor, no? Her lips quirked, a hint of a devilish grin. Apparently, A Dishy healer's apprentice works there. My dorm mates were telling me all about him. I've considered faking a cold to see if they're right. Sounds like he's a bit of a tosser. You're better off avoiding him, Harry replied with mock seriousness.
Yeah, probably, she agreed with a solemn nod. Besides, I prefer beards on my men. Much more macho, you know. Harry rolled his eyes and looked away, hoping the dim lighting masked his flush. Judging by Ginny's cackle, it hadn't. I'm curious, though, she said after a moment of silence. Why go through the effort? No one is ever going to use this place. It just seems like a waste of your time. I guess, he let out a slow breath. He had never consciously considered why he'd done it. But deep down, the answer had always been there. I want to reclaim it. This place was built for healing. Over the centuries, it's been desecrated, beeped from its original purpose. I guess I wanted to.
Ginny tilted her head back to look at him. Make something good? She finished. He gave her a weak smile. It sounds nauseatingly maudlin when you say it out loud. Not really. Besides, I've always known you were secretly a marshmallow, she said, her teasing, light-hearted tone at odds with the look in her eyes. It was something genuine and warm that he couldn't quite name, but he found that he rather enjoyed having it directed at him. Your heart is what I love most about you. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. The place where her lips touched felt unnaturally warm in the frigid underground chamber, and it sent sparks of heat throughout his body. She pulled away, only to raise their combined hands and duck under his arm, leaning into his side. They sat in companionable silence, broken only when Medusa reappeared, shivering from her feast. Harry touched a stone on the floor beside him, which gave off a faint orange as it warmed. Medusa hissed with gratitude and promptly fell asleep at his side. Harry stroked his thumb along the back of Ginny's hand until he mustered up the courage to ask quietly, "Is Maya all right?" She broke her kneecaps when she fell. Madame Pomfrey fixed her up. The bruised ego, though, I suspect that will take longer to heal. Renewed shame flared in his chest. I was so angry, and when she went after John I, his throat seized, and he fell silent. For what it's worth, Hogwarts seems to be on your side. Turns out we weren't the only one Maya and her gang were harassing. Harry shook his head and pulled away. You don't get it. I could have killed her, Jin. Leaning forward, he buried his face in his hands. His head gave a nasty throb, and he flattened his palms against his eyes, pressing until he saw white. It wasn't permanent, Harry, Ginny said soothingly, rubbing his back. Fred does way worse to Ron on a. I wanted to hurt her. His hands muffled his whispered words, but they echoed throughout the chamber all the same. Ginny froze for the briefest of seconds at his admission before snaking her arms around his chest. She sighed, and her breath fanned over the back of his neck. You know, my dad always says that there's a difference between thinking things and doing things. Just because you thought about doing something bad doesn't matter so much. The fact that you didn't do it is what's important. Sure, you had a bit of an episode, but you didn't actually hurt her. Because Moody stopped me, he pointed out. He didn't. He told you to stop, but you could have followed through with it. You didn't, though. That's got to count for something. You can't know that. You weren't even there. No, she agreed, resting her chin on his shoulder. But I know you, and I know you wouldn't have hurt her, because that's not who you are. Harry wanted to argue, to tell her that she couldn't read his mind or know for certain what he might have done. But then she pressed her face into the crook of his neck, and the warmth of her embrace, the flowery perfume of her long, silky hair, drove all arguments from his mind. He didn't know who was right, but he desperately wanted it to be her. Maya made herself scarce in the days that followed their confrontation. His friends were able to move unencumbered throughout the castle due entirely to the fact that Maya rarely left Durmstrang's ship. Even for meals. On the one hand, Harry was relieved that he wouldn't have to protect John or his friends from her wrath, nor did he have the capacity for another showdown. Still, it hurt that his bond with his cousin had soured so completely, and he found himself missing the early days of their relationship. You know, it's times like these that you remind me of your mum, Uncle Sirius explained in a letter after Harry had laid out the situation. Normally, you're all Effie. But Lily hated bullies, too. It's part of the reason she couldn't stand your dad for the first 6 years she knew him. James was insufferable back then, and he'd be the first to admit it. But he grew up, and one day, Maya might too. And if not, well, you've earned John's full admiration by knocking her on her ass in his defense. Speaking of, how are you feeling? John said it was a pretty strong burst of accidental magic. He'd grimaced when he'd read that last bit, because the answer, quite frankly, was unwell. He'd fortunately avoided putting himself in a coma from magical overexposure, but it had been a close thing, according to Madame Pomfrey. To make matters worse, the surge of magic that had entered his body wasn't dissipating at the expected rate. As the days turned into weeks, Harry could still feel something hot and prickly writhing beneath the surface of his skin, desperate to slip out of his body. His friends were sympathetic, but he knew they didn't understand just how dire the situation was. That was until Cedric had the brilliant idea to practice dueling with Harry. And, like an idiot, Harry had agreed. "I don't see why we can't do this inside," Grace grumbled, glaring up at the early morning sun. They were on the grassy lawn near Hagrid's hut, taking full advantage of the uncommonly warm Scottish May morning. "Do we really want to run the risk of one of Ced's competitors seeing us? Better out here where Harry can't blow up the castle," Teddy teased as he and Luna spread out a checked blanket a few meters away. They would be offering moral support in the form of food, which Teddy had procured from the kitchens that morning. "Besides, it's such a lovely morning," Luna added. "It's ideal conditions for spotting blibbering humdingers." "We wouldn't want to miss that," Teddy agreed. "Who knows when we'll get another chance?" Completely missing his joking tone, Luna beamed at Teddy and offered him a kazoo to encourage their mating rituals. Teddy politely declined, citing the need to have both hands free to eat his quiche. Harry finished casting the containment charms and stood up. "I still think this a bad idea," Harry announced. "Maybe Grace or Teddy should duel you." "I'm eating," Teddy reminded him, "and I'm not stupid enough to think I could keep up with Cedric," Grace said. "Ginny, then," Harry said, panic bubbling in his chest. The pebbles and little twigs at his feet responded to his distress and levitated off the ground, spinning like tops. They turned towards Ginny, who was curled up a few feet away, fast asleep. It was impressive that they'd even managed to drag her from her bed this early on a Saturday. Ginny wasn't a morning person. "If I had to choose between you and waking the Hellcat from her slumber, I'd choose you any day," Cedric said after a moment of deliberation. He gave Harry an easy grin. "You should trust yourself more. You won't hurt me." They started off slow, Cedric evidently wanting to ease Harry into it. He launched gentle stunning spells and the odd hex at Harry, and Harry batted away with a basic shield charm. Strangely, Cedric seemed reluctant to use a shield charm in response to Harry's spells, preferring to dodge instead. After one particularly acrobatic feat, where Cedric executed a surprisingly decent one-handed cartwheel to avoid Harry's tickling charm, Harry started to wonder if Cedric could even perform a shield charm. "Why do you dodge so much?" Harry asked 10 minutes later when Grace called their warm-up to an end. He conjured a goblet and filled it with water before handing it to Cedric, who downed it in one go. "A shield charm would be more effective, no?" Cedric was bent double, hands on his knees, and gasping for breath. "You didn't give me time, mate," he replied, his eyebrows drawing together. "I didn't realize your reflexes were that good." Harry pursed his lips. He didn't think he'd been particularly fast. It wasn't like they were actually dueling. "Well, shouting your spells didn't help," Harry offered gently. "Do you think you can cast silently when we duel?" Cedric slowly righted himself, studying Harry with confusion. "We just dueled, Harry. You tell me." "No, I mean..." Harry cut himself off as he and Cedric simultaneously came to the same realization. "That wasn't a warm-up. Were you even trying?" Cedric asked, aghast. Harry tried to think of how to explain without insulting his friend, but Cedric let out a nervous laugh and dropped to the ground. He sprawled out on his back and covered his face with his hands. "Merlin's beard, I'm doomed," he said, voice muffled. "No, you're not," Grace said, kneeling beside him and pulling his hands away. "Harry's just a freak of nature." "Thanks, Gracie." She gave Harry a one-shouldered shrug. "Well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, you've been doing silent magic since you were 11. It's not your fault you're exceptional. And you can do wandless magic," Teddy pointed out. "Limited amounts." "That's a lot more than any of us," Teddy replied. "Harry should have been the champion," Cedric groaned. Absolutely not, Harry said, furious on Cedric's behalf. You were chosen for a reason. Cedric gave him a baleful look. Yeah, because you are too young to enter. Because you're the best man for the job, Harry corrected. You're the best in our year at Transfiguration. You're a quick study, and you think well under pressure. I nearly knocked the castle down the last time I faced a boggart. And that was before my magic was unstable. Think about what it would have looked like if it had been me to face your short snout. You would have flattened the entire stadium, Luna declared gleefully. He probably would have killed the dragon, too, Teddy added. And then you would have been carted away to Azkaban, still reeking of dragon guts, for blowing up a protected beast. And killing the rest of us, said Luna with a sage nod. My point, Harry said, raising his voice to speak over his terrible friends, is that you're a great wizard. Being able to cast a powerful stunning charm doesn't make you a good wizard. If it makes you feel any better, Seed, you're a better duelist than Crumb and Delacour. They jumped at the sound of Ginny's voice. You're awake? Harry asked, glancing at his watch. It hadn't even gone 8. Unfortunately, replied Ginny. She slowly pushed herself into a sitting position, yawning as she rubbed her eyes. Of the two, Delacour is a stronger duelist. Her spellcasting is faster and more fluid than Crumb's, who's quite clumsy with his footwork. If it comes down to a fight between you and him, taking him out with jelly legs Jinx shouldn't be too hard. They gaped at her before Grace asked, How the hell do you know this? Ginny shrugged. I've seen them practicing some mornings. You willingly wake up before breakfast? Teddy asked, voicing their incredulous thoughts. I go flying most mornings, she admitted before returning her attention to Cedric. Delacour will be your biggest threat. She's come in dead last for both tasks and now she's got the most to prove. Grace considered this for a moment. So if Cedric could manage to get a few hits in on Harry, he'd be more than ready for his competition. His friends turned towards Harry, evidently waiting for him to consent to this harebrained scheme. I really don't think this a good idea, Harry stressed for what had to be the 100th time that morning. Still, he resumed his spot across from Cedric and drew his wand. Don't hold back this time, Cedric said, his tone equal parts teasing and dejected. Cast a shield charm, and we'll talk, Harry replied. With a grin and a flick of his wand, Cedric silently did so. Go on, do your worst. He wouldn't, and everyone knew it. Still, Harry pointed his wand at Cedric.
The instant his stunning spell left the tip of his wand, he knew he'd made a colossal mistake. He'd felt a surge of energy a split second before releasing the spell, the ambient magic rising up and flooding Harry's body, scorching his veins. The overpowered spell burst from his wand, the flash of Arlet light so bright it temporarily blinded him. When he regained his vision, Cedric was lying spread eagle on the grass, some 10 meters away.
Swearing, Harry sprinted to Cedric and dropped to his side. He's not breathing, Grace yelled, falling to her knees a second later. Harry dropped his wand and manually began to palpate Cedric's neck and head. He's had the air knocked out of him, Harry said, focusing his magic and trying to locate any breaks within Cedric's body. There were several microfractures in Cedric's ribs, but nothing serious. Revive him for me. Fumbling with her wand, Grace cried out, Enervate. Cedric gasped, and his eyes flew open, only to slam them shut as he let out a groan. Okay, point made. You need to hold back next time. There won't be a next time, Harry snapped, but...
Shut up a minute, will you? I need to focus. Focus on Whoa. Cedric gasped as Harry shoved his exuberant magic through Cedric's body, willing it to mend the breaks Harry had so thoughtlessly created. Like overeager Labradors, the magic responded and flooded through Cedric. Harry's fingers buzzed with energy as the bones knit back together, as if he were touching them directly rather than separated by several layers of skin and muscle and fat. It was as if he was simultaneously inside and out of Cedric's body, like he'd somehow become both a block of marble and a Renaissance sculptor, healing and creating and mending and making.
He was white blood cell in Cedric's veins, flying towards the hangnail on his right middle finger, the minor infection driven out with a rush and the skin mending shut. He was a patch of dry skin on his elbow, smoothing over, the skin healthy and pink. He was the impacted earwax in his ears, sliding away from his eardrums and towards the opening. Harry wrenched himself away and rocked back on his heels, breathing hard as magic surged through him, still desperate to reach its target. It bucked against him, slamming through his chest with so much force he feared he might split in two. Their other friends had made it to them by then, Teddy hovering nervously behind Grace whilst Luna looked on with fascination. Beside Harry, Ginny knelt down and took his hand. He tried to pull away, terrified that the wild magic might leak out of him and into her. She tightened her grip and refused to let go. With a relieved sob, Grace threw her arms around Cedric's neck as he sat up. He distractedly rubbed her back as he glanced around, eyes wide. His hair had grown, falling over the tops of his ears, and a healthy beard covered his jaw. What's that crinkling sound? They paused and listened before Teddy offered, the wind in the leaves? I surprised you could hear anything at all, with how dirty your ears were, Harry managed to say. Cedric turned his stunned gaze to Harry, his eyes wide, as if he were seeing him for the first time. What did you do? Harry shook his head. It was a mistake. I'm so sorry, it won't ever happen again. No, it's... Cedric trailed off and his head rolled back as he stared at the sky like he'd never seen it before. It's incredible. I feel so, I dunno, balanced? I'm so sorry, whispered Harry. No, Cedric said, reaching for Harry. His serene expression melted into something akin to disappointment when he brushed his fingers against Harry's hand. I can't feel it anymore. He sounded genuinely heartbroken. The wild magic, Harry realized. He pulled farther away, finally managing to dislodge Ginny's hand. He balled the ends of his sleeves into his fists and crossed his arms for good measure. I should hope not. Cedric frowned and shook his head as if to clear it. I'm fine, Harry. Better than fine, really. Whatever you did fixed me right up. Give me a minute, and we can go again. No, he needs a break, Cedric, Teddy said, though his pensive gaze didn't leave Harry. Too right, Mr. Knott. Their group spun to find Professor Dumbledore standing several feet away, his blue eyes sparkling behind his half-moon speckles. In fact, Mr. Potter, why don't you come with me? His friends started to shout over one another. He didn't do anything wrong. It was my fault. Professor, nobody got hurt. Percy Weasley did it. They fell silent and turned to Grace, who shrugged. I mean, it can't hurt.
That's my brother, Ginny said, looking distinctly unimpressed.
You can spare one for the cause. Dumbledore raised his hands in a pacifying gesture, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Nobody is in trouble, he explained. I merely wish to speak with him. Harry nodded and got to his feet before his friends could stop him, pausing only to snatch his wand up from the ground beside Cedric. Dumbledore smiled his serene smile and motioned for him to follow. But instead of heading towards the castle, as Harry had anticipated, Dumbledore led him towards the Black Lake. They turned down a small path along the eastern bank, the thick wall of trees and shrubbery quickly obscuring the castle and Harry's friends from view. They walked for several minutes in silence until Dumbledore finally spoke. Madame Pomfrey tells me your studies are progressing well. Harry blinked. That was not what he'd been expecting. Still, he nodded, if not hesitantly. My final exam is next week. I should receive my results in early June. The wheels of bureaucracy do grind slowly, Dumbledore said. I mentioned to the apprentice board that making you wait so long for exams you took in September was cruel. They offered to let me mark them myself. He waved a hand at his face. You might have surmised from my alarmingly crooked nose that I have no talent for the healing arts, and so I regretfully declined. Although Harry would much rather skip the small talk and get to the point, social niceties dictated he play along. He gave what he hoped was a mild smile and replied softly, Thank you anyway, sir. Professor Dumbledore smiled knowingly. They stopped at a clearing along the bank that gave them a lovely view of the lake. Dumbledore pulled his wand from his pocket and conjured two squashy armchairs and a carved wooden table between them. He took the cerulean velvet for himself before offering Harry the cream-colored chintz chair across from him. I'm sure you're curious as to why I've sought you out this morning, Dumbledore began once Harry was settled. Harry tried not to grimace. I have a few guesses, he replied. Namely, my cousin? Professor Dumbledore nodded. Your confrontation with Ms. Ganas is indeed amongst them. You're not in trouble, he added when Harry opened his mouth to explain. Far be it from me to needlessly insert myself into familial disputes. I dare say I'd never sleep if I intervened in a fraction of the arguments I see every day. Regardless, Harry said quietly, I apologize for my behavior. It was unbecoming of me, and it won't happen again. There was a pause as Dumbledore observed Harry over steeped fingers. It will, he said, although not unkindly. Hurt flared in Harry's chest, and he turned his head, staring out over the lake. You're human, Harry, Dumbledore continued gently. Whilst I know you pride yourself on your emotional control, you are but a mere mortal like the rest of us. You will lose your temper from time to time, and that is perfectly normal. Healthy, even. The pronouncement was an oddly accurate assessment of Harry's temperament, which was made only stranger because they rarely interacted. It also echoed sentiments Uncle Remus had shared, leading Harry to idly wonder if the two men had been gossiping about him. Regardless, Harry didn't enjoy such a personal conversation with his headmaster. What is not healthy, Dumbledore continued evenly, is the frankly absurd amount of magic roiling through you. Harry pressed his lips together. Has Madame Pomfrey said something to you? She didn't have to. I can sense it in you. The admission was somehow profound, melodramatic, and incredibly invasive, although he couldn't articulate why. Harry felt as if he were nude, accepting an award he did not want in broadcast for all the world to see. He crossed his arms across his chest, as if it might somehow hide him from Dumbledore's scrutinizing gaze. I don't understand. Dumbledore hummed, bobbing his head as he considered his next words. I have always thought of magic like water, Dumbledore began, gesturing to Black Lake for emphasis. It flows freely, always taking the path of least resistance. Muggles are like stones, upsetting magic's trajectory and forcing it to bend around them. Magical beings, however, their bodies are full of holes, letting the magic flow through them. Despite his discomfort, Harry couldn't help but lean forward, enthralled. After all, how often did one get to hear Albus Dumbledore's theories on magic? The man was a genius and one of the most powerful wizards of the modern age. There are many different types of stone, of course. Some are softer than others, and some are more porous. But regardless, even the strongest stone erodes. It is no match for the might of water. Anxiety fluttered in his chest. Harry sat back and frowned, unsure what to make of this analogy. Are you saying magic kills people? This was not the first time he'd heard that his magic could kill him. Hell, he'd come so close to dying only 2 years ago. His healers had stressed that all it would take was one overpowered spell, one fitful burst of accidental magic, and he'd be destroyed by his magic. His body would burn from the inside, his organs shutting down in quick succession, and he'd slip into a coma, although not before several last agonizing moments of consciousness. Not necessarily. Certainly not all the time, Dumbledore said with a knowing look. Erosion is not always a fast process. It can take thousands of years of waves crashing against a cliff before it falls. But sometimes, if the rock is particularly susceptible to the effects of water and it experiences a traumatic external event, I plummet into the ocean below, Harry finished. No, dear boy, Dumbledore said gently. You are sand on the beach, long ago devastated by magic's strength. From the overexposure to magic my 4th year, his head gave a nasty throb, and he absently scratched his forehead, his scar prickling beneath his fingernails. Professor Dumbledore nodded. Your relationship with magic is far more intimate than your peers. When the waves are peaceful, they wash over you. But when it storms and magic beckons, you cannot help but answer its call. There was something tender in the way he looked at Harry, but not in a loving way. Instead, it was a raw, heartbroken thing. The look of an old man who had seen this tragedy play out many times before, and the ending never change. You are caught up in a storm, Harry, Dumbledore explained gently, and if you do not learn to ground yourself, I fear you will be washed away. It was a bleak thought, and Harry's dark mood soured even more. He sometimes wondered if this was how Teddy felt after seeing a future with no happy ending, no matter how many times he tried to change the outcome. Still, there was something in Harry, something stubborn and snarling that refused to give in. He might nearly be a man, but he was still the child who survived a burning house and an unbeatable curse, who faced basilisks and dementors. He wouldn't go down without a fight. My healer told me that emotional control was key, Harry began. That controlling my emotions would reduce outbursts of accidental magic. For the average patient. There is nothing average about you, Harry, said Dumbledore, raising his hand when Harry began to protest. I will not ask why you preferred to operate under the delusion that you were normal. Normal children have not faced Lord Voldemort 3 times and lived to tell the tale. His heart lurched, and his skin prickled. Despite the cool breeze coming off the lake, it suddenly felt too hot. This wasn't something he wanted to discuss, least of all with Dumbledore. But despite Harry's obvious discomfort, Dumbledore continued on. You are a powerful wizard, Mr. Potter. Extraordinarily so, even before your unfortunate accident. Harry wanted nothing more than to leap from his chair and walk away. Still, he gritted his teeth and forced himself to reply, I'll be more careful in the future, sir. This is not something you will learn on your own, Mr. Potter, Dumbledore said with an uncharacteristic sharpness. You will not learn to control this from a book in any of the libraries you frequent. Harry's eyes darted back to Dumbledore's. And I suppose you can help? He said it snidely, inadvisably so, considering that this was his headmaster, and was shocked when Dumbledore's flinty expression softened. Precisely. Dumbledore leaned back in his seat. Starting next semester, you and I will meet thrice weekly, more if I feel you will benefit from it. Sir, that really isn't. Harry wasn't sure why he was trying to turn down private lessons with Albus Dumbledore. Any wizard would give up their wand arm to do so. But still, the very idea of it sent a panicked shiver down his spine. This is not up for debate, he said firmly, although not unkindly. I have let this go on long enough. I should have started at the beginning of last term, but I was persuaded to allow you to finish your step tests. You are dangerously close to burning out, and I will not watch another student die because of it. Harry's protests died in his throat, and he swallowed painfully. There it was again. That conviction that he was unknowingly at death's door. At last, he nodded. Dumbledore watched him for a moment, clearly expecting Harry to retract his agreement. When he didn't, he nodded. Further details will be provided with your supply list over the summer, he explained, getting to his feet. When Harry followed suit, Dumbledore vanished the conjured furniture with a flick of his wand. I advise you to get as much rest as possible this summer, as you will find very little of it next term. Harry wasn't sure whether to feel offended or terrified by the declaration, considering how little he'd slept this year. I'll be in Greece this summer, so I doubt it, but I thank you for the suggestion. At this, Dumbledore gave him a small smile. I assumed as much. You are Effie's grandson, after all. With that, Dumbledore departed, and Harry was left very much alone. The hands gave it away. Even in the dead of winter, his skin had never been so white. Nor had it ever been so unblemished. Years of brewing potions and spell casting had left Harry's hands scarred and calloused. The fingers were far too short to belong to Harry, although he attributed that to just how tiny the hands were. He might describe them as childlike in size, if not for how waxy and thin the skin was, as if they belonged to a reanimated, millennia-old mummy. What is it? He asked in a voice that was not his own but sounded strangely familiar nonetheless. He ran his skeletal fingers along the arm of the chair, tracing a threadbare patch in the once vivid emerald velvet as he stared into the fire. My lord, a fair-haired man stepped into his line of sight. Despite the fine woolen cloak he wore, there was something distinctly tattered about this man, his pale face wan and deeply lined, although he couldn't be older than 35. He walked with a loping step, moves half aborted midair only to be completed a moment later, as if he were a marionette controlled by a particularly inexperienced puppeteer. A vague part of Harry recognized that this man had extensive spell damage, a long-term effect from being held under the Imperious Curse for many years. Mainly, Harry was annoyed by the interruption. I've brought news from Hogwarts, continued the fair-haired man. And shall I have to guess it? There was a snort from the corner. Harry didn't have to look to know that an impossibly tall, dark-haired man sat just out of his line of sight. Twin spots of red appeared on the blonde's cheeks. The boy will be alone during the final task, my lord. It is all but certain. The man spoke in an excited rush, like a child spoiling the contents of a gift before the receiver had the chance to open it. Certain? He repeated. As certain as it was to have the boy in the competition? The dark-haired man snorted again. As certain as it was when I asked you to remove your distractions, Aurelius. He asked, turning to the dark-haired man, whose gaunt face could not erase his aristocratic features. Even in light of the dying fire, the man held a certain beauty, a fallen angel worn from years of hardship on earth. Aurelius Flint fell silent at once and looked down at the floor. He returned his attention to the blond man. I do not ask for much of you, and yet neither of you has impressed me thus far. You, Aurelius, for your inability to follow a simple command and return to me. And you, Barty, for failing to enter Harry Potter's name in a competition. I will not fail you again, my lord, Barty said, bowing so low he was bent nearly in half. See that you don't, he said. Where is Nagini? A look of unease flickered across Barty's face despite his efforts to suppress it. Good hunting, my lord. Bring her to me, he commanded. I will require all my strength for what is to come. Flint leapt to his feet. Shall I carry you, my lord? Oh, how he detested to be so debased. Soon, he would be restored to his former glory. He consented to be lifted, and as he did, he caught sight of his face in the mirror above the mantel. Several hundred miles away, Harry jerked awake with a scream. Within moments, there was pounding at his door, and Harry attempted to extricate himself from his sweat-soaked blankets. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he stumbled to the door, and his entire body trembled as if he had caught a nasty virus. He wrenched it open to reveal Crowley Toadstool, the seventh-year Slytherin prefect, standing in nothing but a pair of pants. What's happened? Toadstool asked, his pupils dilated behind his lopsided spectacles. I heard screaming. We all heard screaming, Froggy, Grace drawled, appearing at his elbow. Her strawberry bee-owned curls had been corralled into a thick braid, and whilst she had the foresight to grab a dressing gown, she shivered as she stood barefooted in the chilly corridor. Let me deal with this. Toadstool scowled. You're not a prefect. Thank God for that, replied Grace, slipping around him and forcing herself into Harry's bed chamber. Go back to bed. With that, she slammed the door shut in Toadstool's face, casting a silencing spell on it when he banged his fist on the other side. You can go back to bed, Harry muttered. Sorry for waking you. Grace shrugged. I've been up for a while, she said, wandering over to the wingback chair beside the fireplace. She pulled her wand out of the pocket on her dressing gown and cast a quiet incendio before curling up in the chair, her feet tucked beneath her. Harry conjured a chair of his own and joined her by the fire, although not before collecting a still sleeping Medusa from his bed. She grumbled unintelligibly and burrowed deeper into Harry's pajamas. Did you sleep at all? Harry asked, already knowing the answer. Not really, she admitted. She didn't have to elaborate further. All of his friends had grown more restless over the last week as the final task of the Triwizard Tournament approached. At least it will be over soon. The sentiment usually would have brought him relief, but instead, her words sparked a feeling of anxiety within him. They sounded almost familiar. Was something supposed to happen? My results are supposed to come today, Harry gasped, the answer coming to him immediately. He had finished the final step exam only last week, and whilst it had been a weight lifted off of his shoulders, he had been filled with dread as he awaited the outcome. I still think it's mad, making you wait this long to find out if you've passed, Grace said. You took some of those exams in September. Why couldn't they tell you if you've passed then? It was unfair, Harry agreed privately. And truthfully, there wasn't a good reason for it, not when the regular healing students found out if they failed right away. Where's the fun in that? He drawled. You probably wouldn't be having these stress-induced nightmares, for one, Grace pointed out. Harry started to correct her, only to pause. What had his nightmare been about? He tried to recall the sequence of events that led to him waking up in terror, but try as he might, the dream remained elusive, slipping out of his mind like the smoke from a snuffed candle. Something about hands and... Madame Pomfrey said the owl should come around breakfast, he said, shaking his head as if it would clear his thoughts. You'll only have to worry about Cedric after today. Grace grunted and settled into her chair before closing her eyes. Honestly, I think he just wants this over with, she admitted. I don't think he even cares about winning at this point. Cedric had never said as much to him, but Harry got the same feeling from his best friend. He wanted to do well, of course, but over the last few months, Harry could see the toll stress was taking on Cedric. Cedric was a powerful wizard and took great pride in everything he did, but he had never had to perform under such close scrutiny before. Everything he did was watched and discussed, regardless if it had anything to do with the tournament. There were articles written about him in the Daily Prophet about his love life, and he received weekly requests to make appearances on wireless broadcasts. During the Hogsmeade trip last month, Cedric and Grace hadn't been able to enjoy a moment alone before some well-meaning fan wandered over to discuss his performance in the tasks. It was a constant barrage of attention that even Cedric, the consummate extrovert, was worn out. Not that he would ever complain, of course. He was far too good-natured and generous with his time to turn people away. In fact, if it wasn't for Grace, who had no such qualms about voicing her displeasure, he probably would have run himself into the ground trying to please everyone. There was a knock at Harry's door before he could reply, and a moment later, Teddy was stumbling, bleary-eyed and yawning, into the room. "Did Harry wake you up too?" asked Grace. Teddy frowned. "Nah, Blaze saw to that ages ago. He talks in his sleep, wouldn't shut up about Puffskeins this morning." He dropped into the chair Harry had conjured for him with a sleepy, "Thanks." "What did Harry do?" "Nothing," Harry explained quickly before Grace could make it sound more dramatic than it really was. "Just a nightmare." Teddy nodded in understanding, massaging his temples. "Is everything all right?" Harry asked. "You're not having one of your," Grace added, widening her eyes and rotating her head in a circle. "Just a headache," Teddy explained, none too pleased at her depiction of a vision. "I didn't get to sleep until well after midnight. Malfoy wouldn't stop by. Ching about his hair again." "Oh no. Not his beautiful bee. Owned Malfoy locks," Grace cried with mock horror. Teddy snorted. "Please, he's not even a Malfoy." Harry blinked, sure he must have misheard. He glanced over at Grace, who appeared as baffled as he was. "Sorry, what?" Teddy shrugged as if this was somehow common knowledge and their reactions were ridiculous. Everyone knows the Malfoys hate each other. They've both had a string of lovers for ages. Mr. Malfoy didn't even try to hide the fact he was dancing with his mistress at the Avery's Christmas gala this year. The only question is who Draco's real father is. "Is it a Weasley?" At their incredulous looks, Grace shrugged. "They're a fertile bunch." "Best guesses it's a Black, actually," Teddy supplied. "Draco's mum is from that family, so it makes sense." Harry shuddered at the possibility that Uncle Sirius was somehow Draco Malfoy's father. Grace looked horrified. "Wait, so that would mean her own family?" "The purebloods of Britain have a long, sordid history of inbreeding," explained Teddy. "My parents were third cousins on his dad's side. And she was his second wife. His first wife was his first cousin on his mum's side. He doesn't have any Black family features, though," Harry mused, cutting Grace's horrified reply off. "Ah, that's because Mrs. Malfoy transfigures him," Teddy explained with a cheeky, conspiratorial grin, "to hide her infidelity." "That she allegedly doesn't care about," Grace pointed out, still looking vaguely ill. "Human transfiguration doesn't last for more than a few years, though," Harry pointed out, "and that's on adults. Adolescents would need to have the spells recast every few months, and it wouldn't be advisable to do so while the bones are still maturing." "Harry, put your logic to rest and have a little fun, won't you?" Teddy teased. "I suppose if Mrs. Malfoy really was keen on hiding that Malfoy wasn't really a Malfoy, I doubt she'd care if she ked his face up too much," Grace said. Teddy gave her a sly smile. "She's got to be doing something to his hair, at the very least. It's turned a mousy blonde that a real Malfoy would never be caught dead with. Hence the drama last night." Dimly, Harry recalled an instance last year where he'd transfigured Malfoy's hair to a lighter shade and wondered if there was some truth to Teddy's gossip. He refrained from saying as much, wanting to put the conversation to rest. It was far too early in the morning to think about Draco Malfoy. The conversation turned to safer topics, such as Cedric's training schedule and theorizing what Dumbledore would teach Harry when the term started in September. They pointedly ignored the hippogriff in the room that was Harry's mounting anxiety as the clock ticked closer to breakfast. Indeed, Harry was so nervous that he could do little more than poke at his sausage several hours later, his stomach twisting painfully at the very notion of eating anything. He squirmed impatiently in his seat and glanced up so often at the ceiling that he was in danger of pinching a nerve as he searched for the owl that would deliver his fate. He had tried pacing to relieve some of his nerves, but Snape had put a swift end to that, telling Harry to either sit down or get out and stop ruining everyone's breakfasts. "It's going to be fine, Harry," Cedric said soothingly. "You're brilliant at this stuff." "Madame Pomfrey wouldn't have taken you on if she didn't think you could do it," Teddy pointed out. "Yeah, look at Penelope Clearwater," added Ginny. "If you asked Percy, she was the next coming of Merlin, and she was turned away for an apprenticeship." Harry put his search for owls on hold long enough to give her a baffled look. "How did you know about that?" "They had a huge row over it last summer," Ginny explained with a shrug. "They actually broke up over it." "They broke up over my apprenticeship? Well, I think it was the twig that broke the Bowtruckle's back, really," Ginny explained, pursing her lips as if only just now considering if she should be telling him this. "But she didn't like that Percy kept defending you." Grace looked vaguely impressed at this. "I wouldn't have pegged him for it." Ginny rolled her eyes. "Percy is actually incredibly loyal. He just dislikes you because you bit him." "I was 11, and he tried to steal my book," Grace squawked indignantly. "You don't even like reading." Overhead, there was a flutter of wings, and Harry's stomach gave a painful lurch. He looked up as the owls swooped in, laden with packages and letters. Frantically, he searched the aerial chaos, and his gaze landed on a small barn owl fighting its way towards him. He swallowed a wave of nausea that rose in his throat when it landed silently in front of him and stuck out its leg. "You gonna read it?" Teddy drawled when Harry didn't move to take it. "I promise it's not infected with Bleebex," Luna supplied earnestly. "You'd be able to smell onions if it was." Cedric smoothed a hand over the top of Luna's head. "I don't think that's what's worrying him, sweetling." "Here, let me," Grace said, reaching across the table to relieve the owl of its burden, which let out a dull hoot before it took off. Grace slid her thumb beneath the wax seal and shook the parchment open. "There, now you can." Harry leapt to his feet and backed away in horror as if the letter were infected with the bee-black things Luna was babbling about. "It's all right, Harry," said Ginny, placing a soothing hand on his arm. "Delaying it won't change your results." "I can read it for you if you'd like," Grace offered. Mutely, Harry nodded and waved for her to continue. Grace shrugged and turned her attention towards the parchment. "The results of Harry." Grace broke off and looked up. "Your name is Harry?" Despite his terror, Harry managed an incredulous look. "Grace, you've known me for 5 years." "Yeah, but I thought it was short for Henry, like Prince Harry." "No," Harry managed to wheeze out, "it's just Harry." "Oh." She went back to the letter. "The results of Harry James. Your middle name is James?" "Oh, for F. K.S. Sake," Harry snapped, lunging forward and wrenching the letter out of her hands. His eyes flew across the words that would determine his fate. He read them again, a third time, his brain trying to comprehend the enormity of what he was reading. How odd it was that months of stress, revisions, and tests could culminate in a single moment, to a few words on a piece of parchment. "Well?" Cedric asked hesitantly. Harry looked up, finding Grace crying, and smiling. "I've passed," he said through numb lips. It felt like someone else was saying them. "I've passed everything." The words didn't seem real. Around him, his friends erupted. Harry was pulled into at least a dozen hugs, Ginny Key. Ed his cheeks on 2 separate occasions. Uncle Remus appeared to clap him on his back, and words of congratulations were shouted at him from all around until they rattled around in his skull. Through it all, Harry kept glancing at the parchment in his hand and the 28 passes printed neatly beside each exam, his brain desperately trying to reconcile the enormity of what he was reading. He had passed. A hand landed on his shoulder. Harry looked up into the lined face of Professor Dumbledore, whose blue eyes sparkled with delight as he gave him a kindly smile, like a proud grandfather who delighted in his every triumph and success. "I know I speak for all of the faculty at Hogwarts when I say, congratulations, Mr. Potter." "Thank you, Headmaster," Harry murmured, glancing back down at the 28 words that sealed his future. "I should probably tell Madame Pomfrey she's stuck with me." "Poppy will be delighted," Professor Dumbledore agreed, gently patting his shoulder. "Why don't you go now?" Realistically, Harry knew the suggestion was more to regain order in the Great Hall by kicking him, the cause of the commotion, out. Still, he recognized the wisdom in Dumbledore's words and nodded. With the third task starting in a few short weeks, Madame Pomfrey would need his help to prepare. Harry drifted out of the great hall, feeling as if he were floating on air as he made his way to the hospital wing. Inside, he found Madame Pomfrey bent over a trunk, which she was packing with the supplies they would need in the medical tent. She looked up when he entered, arching her brow expectantly. "Judging by the shouting I heard, I assume your results came?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. She straightened to accept the parchment Harry offered her. As she read, she raised a hand to cup Harry's cheek. "Well done." "It doesn't seem real," Harry whispered. After everything his voice broke, and he fell silent, overcome with emotion. Madame Pomfrey looked up at him, tears of pride shining in her eyes. "I know." And she did. After all, she had gone through the same hell he had years ago under his own grandmother's tutelage. She pulled him down into a hug. Harry bent nearly double as he pressed his face into her shoulder. "I studied so hard," Harry whispered, surprised to find himself tearing up as well. Madame Pomfrey carded her fingers through Harry's unruly hair. "I know, dear." How many panic attacks had he suffered under the crushing pressure? How many relationships had he sacrificed in the name of his ambitions? Every sleepless night he spent studying and searching and caring for his patients. It had all been for this moment. And as exhausting and heartbreaking and fascinating and thrilling as it had been, it was done. True, he still had 2 more years of his apprenticeship, but the worst part was finally over. Starting next term, he'd be given solo hours in the hospital wing so he could gain working experience without Madame Pomfrey hovering over his shoulder. In only 2 short years, he could drop the apprentice title. In 2 years. "I'm going to be a healer." Harry should have realized that his friends were up to something, especially since, a week after his results arrived, they still hadn't thrown him an "I survived my step tests" party. That wasn't to say that Grace and Teddy hadn't tried. Fortunately, Ginny caught wind of their plans and dobbed them in before the party left the planning stages. Harry was grateful for her intervention. Whilst he was damn proud of all he had accomplished, he found it inexplicably embarrassing to be the guest of honor at a party. Plus, with the 3rd task only a week away, Harry had a lot of preparations to make. Earlier that week, Ludo Bagman had appeared in the hospital wing and informed them that Harry would be manning his own medical tent during the task. A reward, as Bagman had explained it with a conspiratorial wink, for passing his exams. Ecstatic at the prospect, Harry hadn't fully considered just how unprepared they were for 2 medical tents until Madame Pomfrey pointed out that 2 medical tents meant they would need 2 of everything. As a result, all of Harry's newfound spare time was filled with long days of brewing potions and pastes for any ailment that might befall the champions during the task. So, in a way, it was Ludo Bagman's fault for Harry's inattentiveness. If he hadn't been so busy, he might have noticed how Grace was receiving an inordinate amount of letters. Or that Luna and Teddy's hushed conversations always fell silent whenever Harry got too close. Or how Cedric was looking particularly guilty. And, honestly, it was a stroke of genius to send John to do their dirty work. "Can I borrow the cloak?" John asked, poking his head into Harry's office. Harry barely looked up from his cauldron of stomach soother. "Top drawer of my desk," he said, jerking his chin in its general direction. "Try not to bother Medusa." "Cheers," John called as he crossed the room to Harry's desk. There was a rattle as John slid open the indicated drawer. "And there's my favorite snake." "I desire the cold mice," Medusa said. "Don't give her any," Harry snapped, his knife hovering over the ginger root he was slicing. "Grace gave her 3 already today." "Lies." "Blimey, only 3?" John asked. "She deserves at least 5. "This is true." John reappeared, Medusa wrapped around his neck and shoulders like a scarf, the invisibility cloak bundled under his arm. "I'll give this back to you tonight," he promised. "Medusa or the cloak?" Harry asked as he dumped the ginger into his cauldron. Immediately, the potion began to froth, and Harry stirred the viscous yellow liquid anti-clockwise. When it had thinned, Harry wiped his stirring rod off on a rag. "Because we've still got 2 hours of our shift." "You work her too hard," John said. He stroked a knuckle along Medusa's back, and she sighed with pleasure. Harry rolled his eyes. Medusa slept at least 12 hours a day. "What do you need the cloak for?" "I'm meeting a bloke," John replied casually. It was hard to describe the glee that ran through Harry's body at John's admission. John was generally open about most things in his life, but when it came to romance, He tended to play his cards close to his chest. "Oh, did Dean finally agree to go on a date with you?" he asked, trying not to sound too excited. He didn't want to spook him, after all. The tips of John's ears turned pink, and his eyes darted around the office, looking everywhere but at Harry. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Right," Harry agreed, his tone light. "Dean's my mate." "Of course. And we share a dormitory." "That's true." There was a beat of silence that was far more uncomfortable for his brother than for him. "Right, well." John cleared his throat and untangled Medusa from his neck. "Thanks for the cloak. I'll make sure it gets back to you by tonight," Harry finished, smiling when John continued to squirm, "as we've established." John glared as he placed Medusa on the workbench. "You know what? Just for that," he spun around on his heel and marched towards the door, wrenching it open. Knocks. The torches that illuminated Harry's office spluttered out, plunging him into darkness. Chuckling, Harry waved his hand, and the torches burst back to life. The rest of his shift passed in a hectic blur, and Harry was relieved when Madame Pomfrey released him for the evening. With Medusa tucked safely in his bag, Harry set off towards the Great Hall for dinner, only to be intercepted by Cedric. "Can you let me into the study?" he asked, taking the grand staircase 3 at a time until he stood breathless beside Harry. "I can't find Ginny, and I really need to get that book on Macedonian beasts you lent me." "Were you planning on reading it at dinner?" Harry asked, nodding towards the third-floor landing and starting down the corridor. "Because I distinctly remember you telling me last week that it was rude to read at meal times." Cedric scoffed. "That's because it is rude, mate. Sides, I wasn't planning on going to dinner." Harry paused mid-step in front of an abandoned classroom, hand hovering over the brass doorknob. Cedric, who was always getting on Harry for skipping meals, wasn't going to dinner. "What's going on?" he asked, suspicion coloring his words. "Nothing," Cedric said, his voice shooting up an octave. At Harry's wide-eyed stare, Cedric continued doing absolutely nothing to reassure him as he tripped over his words. "Well, you'll like it and it's better than what Grace and Teddy wanted, but I promise you'll like this and—" When Harry tried to retreat, Cedric blocked him, using his height and broader build to his advantage. "No, please don't leave. I promise it's nothing bad." "What is going on?" Harry repeated. Discomfort twisted Cedric's features as he debated how much to tell him. "It's a party," he said slowly. "But just us in the study. I made sure of it." Harry blinked. "That's it? Oh, I thought you lot did something illegal," he said with a relieved laugh. Unmistakable guilt flashed across Cedric's face. "Well, I mean, technically? Don't tell me there's fire whiskey, again. You know Teddy can't handle the stuff." He pushed open the door to the abandoned classroom and crossed to the fireplace tucked in the corner. With a hiss of Parseltongue and a resigned sigh, he waved Cedric through the secret passage before following after. Only to come face to face. Well, technically face to shoulder, with his illegal surprise. "Took you long enough," Marcus said. "What kept you?" "Harry was being stubborn," Cedric said, giving Harry a chagrined smile. Harry blinked, trying to process how his very tall friend managed to sneak, unnoticed, into the castle. "What are you doing here?" "Celebrating your achievement, you numpty," Marcus replied. He smacked something into Harry's chest, and, numb, Harry looked down to find his invisibility cloak. "Your brother said you're—" "Hang on, he had me write this down, even written phonetically." Marcus still managed to butcher John's message. "Sounds Greek to me, but I assume it's an insult?" Even in his stunned state, Harry wasn't about to translate the rude phrase and merely nodded. He then asked, "But what are you doing here?" Marcus rolled his eyes before clapping a massive hand across Harry's back and shoving him further into the study. All of their friends were present and scattered around the room. Ginny messing with a gramophone she found who knew where. Luna and Teddy, setting a large round table that someone had conjured in the middle of the study. And Grace, flitting around the room, charming lit candles to hang in the air. "Well, I could hardly show up in Hogsmeade, could I? My maniac of a father is still at large. Plus, he's a famous Quidditch player now," Grace chimed in. "And a star-crossed lover, at that," Teddy added. "So tragic, playing against your boyfriend." "How is Oliver, by the way?" Cedric asked as he crossed the room to Grace's side and began helping her with the candles. As they took their seats around the table and began to pass around the dinner the house elves had prepared for them, Harry listened as Marcus brought them up to date with his life, and as they had just got a flat together, Oliver Wood's life by extension. With the Quidditch season ended, Marcus was on holiday until conditioning started up again at the end of summer. He and Oliver were leaving to visit family in the south of France in early July. Still, he assured Harry he'd be around for his 17th birthday. "You're visiting Greece?" Harry asked, delighted by the news. He'd be returning to the Asclepian for the summer, but he was sure he'd be able to sneak away after he'd completed his seminars and shifts for the day. Marcus nodded as he took a drink from his goblet. "Thought I'd meet this Maya you lot keep going on about." He shot Harry a look as he said this, and Harry got the distinct impression that he'd be cornered eventually to discuss the Maya situation. "Blimey," Teddy gasped, turning his head towards Harry. "I didn't even think. That'll be awkward, won't it?" Harry had seen little of his cousin since their showdown several weeks ago and wasn't looking forward to spending an extended amount of time in her presence for the next 2 months. "Fortunately, I'll be staying in the dormitories this summer, so I'll only really have to see her at family dinners." Said dinners that lasted hours, occurred a minimum of 3 days a week, and were more or less mandatory. He figured he would cross that bridge when he got to it. The conversation drifted as they caught up with Marcus. The letters they'd exchanged a poor substitute for actually speaking with him.
The atmosphere was easy and light, and each of them managed to set aside their worries for the evening and enjoy their short time together. The house elves had prepared a veritable feast, providing them with a roasted ham and so many side dishes that Harry wasn't entirely sure he managed to try them all. Between the food and the elderflower wine that Marcus had brought, Harry felt pleasantly warm and more relaxed as the night progressed. After supper, they relocated to the sitting area whilst they discussed their summer plans. Grace explained that she would be spending most of her holiday with her grandparents, whilst Cedric had an internship with the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad at the Ministry. "Don't know if I'll like it, but it's better than working with Dad, I reckon." Luna, Ginny, and Teddy were likewise staying in England, although Teddy doubted he'd be able to sneak out of the family manor to visit. "How have you been?" Marcus muttered, pulling Harry aside whilst the others chatted. Harry nearly shrugged and brushed off the concern, but a stern look from Marcus had him reconsidering. "The headaches aren't getting any worse, I think," he explained slowly. "Or maybe they are, but I don't have stress headaches on top of them." Marcus pursed his lips. "Have you been getting any sleep?" "More now than before. Then again, it was hard to go anywhere but up, considering he'd been averaging 3 hours a night for most of the year. But with the increase in sleep came a marked increase in nightmares. Although the subject matter continued to elude him upon waking, an uneasy discomfort lingered in the back of his mind as he went about his day. As if sensing that there was to the story, Marcus raised an eyebrow and prompted, "But." The dreams seemed like a silly, inconsequential thing to admit aloud, even more so to worry Marcus about it. "And yet, I've been having these dreams," he admitted. "They feel important, but I can't remember what happens." "Do you keep a dream journal?" Teddy asked, butting into their conversation. He was sat in the closet armchair to them, abandoning all pretenses of privacy as he twisted around, pulling his legs up to kneel on the cushions.
Harry shot a nervous look at the others, relieved that none of them had seemed to notice. In fact, he was surprised Teddy had managed to hear anything at all, considering Grace and Ginny had convinced the others into a thunderous round of charades. The last thing Harry wanted to do was bring anyone else into his problems, but he had promised Marcus to bring the others in, hadn't he? Although he wasn't quite ready to admit all of his secrets just yet, maybe admitting this one was a step in the right direction. Gathering his courage, Harry asked, "What's a dream journal?" "Exactly what it says on the tin," Teddy said with a cheeky smile. "It's a journal where you record your dreams."
"That's part of the problem, though," Harry explained. "I can't remember any of them."
Teddy nodded patiently. "You've got to train your brain to remember them," he said matter-of-factly. "It's quite a common problem in divination, actually." "I'm not a seer," Harry needlessly pointed out. "And this isn't divination. It's just some weird dreams."
Teddy pursed his lips, unimpressed with Harry's quick dismissal. "Look, I know Trelawney is a right fraud, but the subject isn't entirely useless. I mean, there's a reason it's an option at Hogwarts. Seer or no, Anybody can be taught the basics of divination.
It couldn't hurt to try, Marcus agreed. Despite Teddy's insistence that divination was a legitimate subject, Harry had his reservations. The whole subject seemed too subjective for it to be useful to those without any sort of sight. Then again, he didn't have any better ideas. What would I need to do? He asked with a resigned sigh. Teddy's face lit up with excitement. You'll try it then? Excellent. To start, you'll. What are you lot whispering about over there? Grace called from across the room. Harry's health, Marcus replied dryly. Like how he's lost weight? Cedric asked. Or his bad vision? Ginny asked. Harry pursed his lips. Aren't we supposed to be celebrating me? Why are you criticizing me? Or the dark circles under his eyes, Grace added. It's not that bad. Grace gave him an unimpressed once-over. Harry, if the circles under your eyes got any darker, the London Zoo would kidnap you, thinking that you were an escaped panda. Well, that's hardly his fault, Luna chimed in, voice airy. He's been infested with Eurasian snicklicks. Suddenly finding his patience for Luna's eccentricities vastly diminished, Harry sighed. What are those, Luna? Luna pulled a copy of the Quibbler from the pocket of her robes. They're creatures who infest the pillows of forlorn lovers, making their eyes dark and bloodshot. By making their victims look so tired, the lost love returns to them out of concern. Daddy thinks snicklicks delight in human love. But how would he know that? Teddy asked, lips quirked into a frown. I assume they can't speak. Seems a bit altruistic, no? Luna nodded gravely. I've tried to explain to Daddy that it's because snicklicks want two victims to harvest their earwax, but he's rather sentimental. Hang on, Grace said, a maniacal gleam lighting her hazel eyes. Harry could tell she didn't buy into Luna's cryptids one bit. Still, Grace wouldn't be Grace if she passed up an opportunity to beleaguer Harry. Are we just going to ignore the fact that Harry's snicklick infestation means he's got a lover we don't know about? What the hell, Harry? You've been holding out on us, Marcus said with a wicked grin. Mortified, his gaze shot towards Ginny, hoping she'd rescue him. The traitor merely sent him a sly wink. Swallowing down the growing pit in his throat, Harry said, well, seeing as I'm not infested with anything, I highly doubt that. That wasn't a no, Cedric pointed out. Harry rolled his eyes. Weren't you lot just insulting me? Let's go back to that. You've got a rather large hedgehog growing out of your face, Grace declared obligingly. You need to shave. Harry touched the stubble that darkened his jaw as Ginny leapt to his defense. I like the beard, Harry. Don't listen to her. He looks like a hermit that's just wandered out of the woods for the first time in a decade, Grace replied. Well, at least they weren't discussing his love life anymore. A heartsick one at that, Teddy added. And people wondered why he didn't like parties. Although dubious about its efficacy, Harry dutifully followed Teddy's instructions and kept a dream journal. Being a seer made him something of a professional. After all, every night, Harry went to sleep with a pen and parchment on his bedside table, and the first thing he did every morning was write down what he could recall. It was embarrassingly little. A dream about a house, a group of faceless men arguing. It was frustrating, although Teddy didn't seem particularly concerned with his lack of progress. We don't start learning dream interpretation until 4th year for a reason, he explained a few days later. They were in Harry's office, Teddy's feet up on the desk as Harry hunched over a cauldron of Chimera antivenom. Luna had joined them, squeezing herself into the chair with Teddy so that she was half sitting in his lap. I mean, you wouldn't start mending broken bones until you learn to heal a paper cut, right? Training your inner eye takes time. Are you sure it's a dream? Luna asked, looking up from the potions essay she was working on. Daddy says that the Department of Mysteries is experimenting with subconscious mind control. Harry, whose head was pounding from stress, lack of sleep, and potion fumes, gritted his teeth. They happen while I'm asleep, he offered diplomatically. He reached for a glass beaker he'd covered with a thin leather membrane and offered it to Medusa. Bite, please. Medusa reared back and struck the beaker with so much enthusiasm that Harry nearly dropped it. Thin streams of clear venom shot into the beaker, thick as syrup and cold enough that Harry could feel its chill through the glass. Medusa hummed with excitement and her body thrashed around on Harry's workstation, nearly knocking over a vial of scarab beetles. Teddy ran his fingers along Harry's messily scrawled dream journal before landing on the last entry. A vague recollection of rabbits, he read aloud, his dark eyes narrowing with concentration. You're positive it was rabbits? Harry struggled to free Medusa, who had sunk her fangs so deep into the membrane that she was stuck up to her gums. Vague is the operative word there, Harry reminded him as he shoved his thumb into his snake's mouth and worked her jaw free. He hissed in pain when a drop of icy venom landed on the back of his hand. Hold still, will you? Finally freed, Medusa let out a sibilant, snake-wise cough. You never let me bite things.
That's not true. You bit me last night, Harry snapped before he turned back to his cauldron. He dumped the venom into the potion and watched as the color slowly turned a violent shade of magenta. Satisfied with the color, he lowered the flame beneath his cauldron and turned his attention back to Teddy. I think I was in a field. I can't remember if I was the rabbit or not. Teddy nodded slowly, his gaze growing hazy and unfocused. I think it would more likely be a hare, if that were the case. But if you were watching rabbits in a field, can you remember what they were doing? Running. Maybe they were eating.
Were they late for something? Luna asked without a trace of sarcasm. I find that white rabbits in particular always seem to be late for one thing or another.
Does it matter? Harry asked, exasperated. Teddy blinked, his mind refocusing on the present. A great deal, actually. How so? Harry asked. Whilst animal motifs have meanings, what they are doing gives dreams their context. Let's take the rabbit as an example. If they're eating a farmer's crops, that might mean a famine is imminent. If they're running, you'll need to make quick decisions in the near future. If you see a warren, the number of kits indicates how many children you'll have. That sort of thing. He said it so patiently that Harry immediately felt guilty for snapping at him. He was only trying to help.
I'll try harder to remember, Harry said before picking up his crystal stirring rod and giving his antidote 3 stirs anti-clockwise. And to Harry's credit, he really did try. But, as Teddy had said, developing any skill took time, even skills for a subject as woolly as divination. The day of the third task dawned far too soon, however, and all thoughts of dreams were quickly shoved aside for all that needed to be accomplished. The hospital wing was a flurry of excitement as house elves helped Madame Pomfrey pack up their supplies and relocate them to the 2 medical tents. Harry, meanwhile, was left to oversee the ward itself, tending to sick students and medically clearing the champions for the task that evening. Crumb and Delacour were easy enough patients. Crumb was as taciturn as ever, and although Harry noted decreased reaction time due to mild sleep deprivation, there wasn't anything that would bar Crumb from the competition. Harry cleared him for the task after suggesting that he take a nap. Delacour was likewise healthy, with her blood pressure slightly elevated, no doubt because of the stress. Cedric, on the other hand, had a great many subjects he wanted to chat about and was doing a marvelous job distracting Harry from his work. We should have a party, Cedric declared. I believe we had one last week, Harry reminded him as he tried to take Cedric's pulse. We exposed one of Hogwarts' security flaws in the process, if you'll recall. Cedric grinned. That one was for you, though, he said. We need to celebrate the end of this bloody tournament. Harry wondered if Cedric knew that Teddy and Ginny were decorating the Hufflepuff common room at that very moment. Grace had initially planned to join them, but she had skivved off herbology one too many times, and there was a real chance she wouldn't pass her owl if she missed any more lessons. Not your inevitable victory? He asked. The jovial expression on Cedric's face flickered for a moment. Between you and me, I don't even care anymore. I'm just so. Harry gave him a knowing smile and squeezed his elbow. He didn't need a healing spell to see how exhausted Cedric was. Between practicing spellwork and dodging his hordes of fans, Cedric rarely got a moment's rest. Just a few more hours, Harry promised. Now, stop distracting me and stick out your hands. Cedric snickered but did as he was instructed. Harry tapped his wand against Cedric's upturned palms, and a bright green ball of light appeared. It skittered across his hands like an ice cube in a hot frying pan before sinking into his skin. Latent magical absorption, 4 skips. Is that good? Cedric asked curiously as Harry wrote the results down in his chart. It's a measure of how quickly your body can process foreign magic, Harry explained. You're on the faster side of average, but it's nothing to be concerned about. Cedric's eyes were alight with interest. Fast is good, right? Depends, Harry said, sticking his hand out between Cedric's. Cast the charm on me. The incantation is Sorbow. Make sure that a sound is long.
The honey-colored ball of light shot out of Cedric's wand and into Harry's hand so fast that if he had blinked, he would have missed it.
That's a classic symptom of magical overexposure, Harry explained. My body absorbs latent magic too fast. If the situation were reversed, and I were your patient doing a health screening, you'd need to withdraw me from the tournament. Cedric's brow furrowed. It's that serious? Are you all right? Even though there was nothing remotely humorous about his condition, Harry couldn't help but grin. That was nothing. Last month, when Madame Pomfrey checked me, I somehow managed to pull her wand out of her hand. Cedric let out an interested, huh? Why were they different colors? Harry shrugged. It's like a Patronus. Everyone's is different. So I'm yellow and you're green, Cedric said slowly before lunging forward and grasping Harry's arms. Merlin's beard, Harry. We're stereotypes. Harry laughed and rolled his eyes. Helga and Salazar would be so proud. I wonder what Gracie's is, Cedric pondered, his gaze growing distant. Later, Harry said, redirecting his focus back to the exam. Cedric was on his best behavior for the remainder of the appointment, and Harry found him healthy enough to participate in the third task. Harry sent him on his way, although not before cryptically informing him that there was someone who wanted to see him in the entrance hall. Cedric gave him a mock salute and bounded out of the hospital wing, unknowingly heading towards a joyful reunion with his parents. The rest of Harry's morning passed in a hectic blur, and all too soon Harry was sitting down for a feast in the Great Hall. He found Cedric and Ginny already at the Hufflepuff table, as were Mr. and Mrs. Diggory, and he quickly joined them, slipping into the spot Ginny had saved for him. Across from him, Cedric's parents sandwiched the man of the hour, who looked about as thrilled to be at the center of attention as a man walking to the gallows. Today's the big day, Mr. Diggory exclaimed, ruffling Cedric's hair. Judging by Cedric's wan smile, this was not the first time Mr. Diggory had said this. Are you ready to see our boy win? Harry grinned and leaned forward. There isn't a doubt in my mind, sir. Our boy is Hogwarts' crown jewel, after all, he said conspiratorially. He was rather proud of himself for not reacting when Cedric aimed a well-placed kick at his shin. Dad, did I tell you that Harry passed his exams? Cedric said loudly, trying to, rather unsubtly and unsuccessfully, redirect the conversation. Ah, yes. I do believe you wrote about it last month. Although Mr. Diggory's smile was pleasant, there was absolutely no doubt in Harry's mind that the man cared very little about his accomplishments. Last week, dear, Mrs. Diggory corrected gently. Harry waved it away. Last month, last week, honestly, with all the excitement, I can hardly remember. Harry considered taking the piss a little more, but one look at Cedric's taut expression had him considering otherwise. But I hear it, congratulations, is in order for you, Mr. Diggory. Seed said you had a promotion? Harry did his best to distract Mr. Diggory's well-meaning exuberance so Cedric could enjoy the feast. A feat made significantly easier as their remaining friends trickled into the Great Hall. When Grace arrived, she did her best to force Cedric to eat, although he did little more than spread his roast chicken around his plate. By the time Professor Dumbledore stood and dismissed the champions from the feast, Cedric's complexion had grown ashy. Still, he put on a brave smile and waved to his schoolmates, who cheered so loudly that Harry's ears rang. After planting a key on Grace's lips, Cedric followed Ludo Bagman and the other champions out of the Great Hall. Grace's cheery expression collapsed the second Cedric was out of sight, and Harry wrapped a loose arm around her shoulders. When she didn't shrug off his embrace, he stooped to press a key to the top of her head. He'll be fine, she said. Harry pretended not to notice the way her voice trembled. Course he will be, he agreed. Seed knows his stuff. He better, Grace snarled. We just spent the last 4 months preparing him for this. If he gets hurt, I'll set him right, Harry finished, and then I'll kill him. Harry chuckled and gently tugged on the end of her play. I'll kindly ask you to leave me out of your domestic disputes, thank you. He dodged the elbow Grace trained at his ribs with a laugh. Don't you have bones to go heal, or something? I hope not, Harry replied with a grin. But a glance at his watch showed that he really did need to report to his station. Bidding his friends goodbye, Harry followed the champions down to the Quidditch field, where he found Madame Pomfrey already bustling around her tent. A small field hospital with 2 beds and several well-stocked cabinets of medical supplies. There was a large wooden table by the entrance, on which lay a map of the maze and an odd contraption that looked a cross between a wireless and a Muggle telephone. The map showed Cedric and the other champions congregated along the northern end of the maze, with their health status labeled along the edge of the parchment in tidy handwriting. Also labeled were the hundreds of obstacles, be they beasts or enchantments, designed to test the champions in the maze. "You'll be on the south side of the field," Madame Pomfrey said in lieu of a greeting. "There are more beasts out that way, so be prepared for bites and stings. Especially from those damned mutts Rubeus bred." It was a true sign of her anxiety that Madame Pomfrey was anything but a consummate professional toward her co-workers. Not that Harry thought her reaction was unfounded, of course. After months of research, they still hadn't managed to develop a fast-acting antidote for blast-ended scroot stings. It was so bad, in fact, that Madame Pomfrey had petitioned Professor Dumbledore that Hagrid remove the scroots from the care of magical creatures curriculum, as they couldn't keep up with the influx of injuries the beasts inflicted on students. Harry thanked her for the heads-up before crossing the tent to rearrange the rows of salves and healing potions in a nearby cabinet. There was nothing wrong with it, per se, but the house elves who set up the tent evidently didn't know how Madame Pomfrey liked to have things arranged, alphabetically by function, then size of the bottle, then color. "Oh, and put that on." She jerked her chin towards a strip of green cloth sitting on a table next to the map. "We've got to identify ourselves as healers, apparently. Ministry's orders." Harry looked more closely at his mentor and saw she was wearing an armband around her right arm, the lime green fabric a stark contrast against her crisp white robes. He picked up the fabric she had indicated and rubbed his thumb along the silver-embroidered crossed wand and bone insignia of St. Munoz Hospital. "This has an enchantment on it," he said. It was faint, but Harry could feel the faint hum of magic emanating from the strip of fabric, thrumming like a colony of ants just below the Earth's surface. Madame Pomfrey paused to give him a curious look. "Yes. Monitoring charms." Phileas added them. She crossed the tent to stand beside him and pointed to her name near the edge of the maze. "He didn't like how we couldn't track your health during the last task." He hummed in acknowledgement and slipped the armband over his arm, grimacing as the pulsing magic intensified, as if the ants were trying to slip under his skin. He flexed his fingers, hoping the sensation would dissipate. "Is there anything else I need to know?" "Call for me if you need help," she said, pointing to the strange contraption sitting on the table. "It's called a chatterbox. No idea if it works. Charity made it. You'll have one in your tent as well, should you require my assistance. If you speak into the mouthpiece." She moved to stand beside him and picked up a goblet-shaped piece of metal attached to the chatterbox by a wire, and mimicked speaking into it. "She promises that this will transmit your voice to my box." Her grimace spoke volumes about her belief in the Muggle Studies professor's invention. "Regardless, I'll come by to check on you if you end up with a patient. Although I have no doubt you'll manage fine on your own. You're prepared." Warmth spread through Harry's chest at her praise. "I learned from the best." Despite her obvious stress, a small smile quirked her lips, and she reached up to pat his cheek. "Are you nervous?" Harry considered this for a moment before shaking his head. "I'm more worried for the champions." She offered him a wry smile. "Get used to it," she said. "Students seem to wake up every morning with the sole purpose of causing me grief. Even me. Especially you," she said, before waving her hands to shoo him away. "Now, get out of my sight." With a mock salute, Harry bid her farewell and ducked out of the medical tent. The sun was dipping below the horizon as Harry walked the perimeter of the maze. Above him, the spectators, students and members of the public alike, were filtering into the stands, filling the rapidly cooling night air with the hum of excitement and anticipation. He encountered the stooped form of Professor Moody, who scowled fiercely, his non-magical eye trained on Harry whilst the magical one pointed intently at the maze. "Ministry won out, then?" he asked, inclining his head toward Harry's arm. Harry grimaced and slipped a finger beneath the armband, tugging it as if it might relieve the buzzing magic that crawled beneath his skin. "I guess the healer's robes weren't obvious enough." Moody grumbled about government oversight as he drew his wand and shot a spell at the armband. The fabric loosened around Harry's arm, and while it did nothing to ease the irritating pulse of foreign magic, Harry appreciated the gesture all the same. "Stay out of trouble, Harry," Moody said in response to Harry's thanks. He stomped away, turning the corner of the maze and disappearing from sight. Harry continued towards the second medical tent, his medical tent, which was nearly identical to Madame Pomfrey's, right down to the improperly arranged supply cabinet. The only difference was the velvet pillow on the table by the chatterbox, where Medusa was coiled up, looking quite pleased with herself. "You have got to be the most spoilt reptile in all of Britain," he said as he scooped her up and draped her over his shoulders. "It's not even heated," she groused, her tongue flicking against the shell of his ear. She began to list all of the terrible tragedies that had befallen her that afternoon. She hadn't seen John. Harry had made her work. She couldn't catch a rat she found earlier. As Harry busied himself with fixing his supply cabinet, the gentle clink of potion vials and the smell of antiseptic soothing his mounting anxiety. As he worked, he ran his finger over the vials of blood replenisher before pocketing a few. If he had learned anything from last June, it was that it was always a good idea to have a few vials of the stuff in an emergency. Outside the thick fabric walls of the medical tent, the crowd's muffled din rose to an audible roar, and Harry caught snippets of a magnified voice announcing the start of the final task of the Triwizard Tournament. As the first cannon sounded, marking Krumm's entry into the maze, Harry abandoned his own task and crossed the medical tent to the table by the door. He watched on the map as Krumm ran into the maze, then Cedric, and finally, Delacour. Even with the map, Harry struggled to track their positions within the narrow, winding hedges. "What is on your arm?" Medusa asked, jolting him from his concentration. She shimmied down and squeezed her head between the fabric with a curious hiss. Harry considered how best to explain the purpose of the armband to his snake. He settled on, "The tournament organizers told me to wear it." "You dislike it." She said it so plainly that Harry was taken aback. Despite her propensity towards self-centeredness, Harry sometimes forgot how perceptive Medusa could be. "There are enchantments on it," he explained. "They're uncomfortable." Medusa forced the rest of her body through the gap between his arm and the band, managing to pull it off as she landed on the table with a dull thud. "Don't wear it." Harry rolled his eyes. "I have to." He reached for the armband, only for Medusa to grab it in her mouth and dart away. "Medusa, give it back." "Wear it later," she declared. She reappeared a moment later, a smudge of dirt on her head and no armband in sight. "You feel better now." Harry started to argue, only to realize that she was right. Whilst his anxiety hadn't entirely dissipated, he felt a lot more settled now that the pulse of foreign magic was gone. "Just bring it back if I have to leave," he grumbled as he turned his attention back to the map. He watched as Cedric headed west, the fork in the path he'd chosen leading him farther away from the center of the maze. Delacour, meanwhile, seemed to be on fire, although she extinguished herself before the burns passed beyond superficial. Krumm was somehow upside down in the northeast corner, although his vitals didn't indicate he was under any stress. "This is boring," she hissed some time later. "Incredibly," Harry agreed. "But it's better than someone needing our help." "For whom? Shouldn't you be on the patient's side?" "They're not my patients yet." Cedric very nearly became one, however, when he almost drowned in the Kappa Lake. Delacour, whilst physically unharmed, was rattled after her encounter with a boggart. Krumm was likewise physically sound, although his progress through the maze had been stunted when he hit a dead end and had to retrace his steps. Medusa eventually curled back up on her pillow with a disgruntled hiss. "Wake me up when something happens." Harry scowled and wiggled the pillow back and forth. "I need you awake," he replied. "If you're so bored, go find my armband." She attempted to ignore him, but when Harry threatened to take her pillow away, she sulked off to retrieve the armband. Minutes passed by in blissful silence until he realized that it hadn't taken Medusa nearly as long to hide the armband as it had for her to bring it back. "What's taking you so long? You better not be asleep," he called out without drawing his gaze from the map. Despite his earlier mistakes, Krumm was very near the center of the maze. In fact, Harry bent closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Krumm couldn't be more than 5 meters from the Triwizard Cup. The only thing that stood between Krumm and victory was a single sphinx. Assuming Krumm answered the riddle correctly, of course. A flurry of emotions raced through Harry at the sight of the two neatly labeled dots on the map. Whilst he would have loved nothing more than for Cedric to win, Harry was relieved that this damned tournament would be over soon. He felt mildly guilty for it, but hadn't Cedric been vocal in his apathy towards winning as well? Besides, Harry failed to see how navigating through a maze had any bearing on Cedric's magical skill. The whole task seemed to rely more on luck than anything else. His thoughts were disturbed by the chatterbox, which burst to life in a rush of ear-piercing static. Medical on standby. Harry couldn't place the tinny voice that came out of the device, but it was distinctly masculine. Crumb has engaged the Sphinx. Well, bullocks. Brow furrowing, Harry bent closer to the map, wishing he could see the fight unfold. The map showed frighteningly little, only two dots dancing around each other and a set of vitals. Crumb was unhurt, but for how long? Sphinxes were supernaturally fast. Even if he transformed into his thestral form, there would be no escaping the attack. North Medical standing by, Madame Pomfrey's voice crackled through the tent, approximately 75 meters from the patient. Medusa, bring me the armband, Harry commanded as he reached for the mouthpiece on the chatterbox. He lifted the heavy metal piece to his mouth. It's gone. Between determining his distance from Crumb and calculating Crumb's survivability of a Sphinx attack, it took a moment for him to realize what Medusa was saying. What do you mean, it's gone? I can't find the magical fabric. The masculine voice on the chatterbox cut through the tent again. South Medical, do you copy? Look again, he hissed before raising the mouthpiece to his lips. South Medical standing by. Approximately 50 meters from the patient. There was a long pause before the masculine voice replied, South Medical, prepare for emergency evacuation. South Medical copies. A chill ran down his spine, for even as he spoke, Crumb's vitals began to plummet as he sustained a deep laceration to his scalp. If the head injury wasn't bad enough, extremity fractures quickly followed, snapping ribs and bones in a matter of seconds. With his wand clutched tightly in his fist, Harry sprinted out of the tent, nearly colliding with Professor Sprout and Moody. No words were spoken between them as Professor Sprout swung her wand towards the maze, bending the walls of hedges to form a narrow tunnel that would allow them to pass, single file, to Crumb's location. Moody plowed through first, his scared and broken body belying the spryness to his step as he charged ahead. Sprout and Harry followed after, reaching the scene mere seconds after Moody. Still, in those seconds, the retired Auror proved just how capable he was, and had managed to subdue the Sphinx before Harry had barreled onto the narrow path. The Sphinx paced angrily some 20 feet away, leaving bloody paw prints in the grass with every step. Her almond-shaped eyes were narrowed, locked on the mangled body of Crumb, as if calculating how to continue with her tough attack. Good heavens, Professor Sprout breathed as Harry dropped to his knees beside Crumb, a gold shower of glittering monitoring charms hovering over his body. Is he alive? Harry confirmed, before he set to work. Madame Pomfrey had drilled into him the steps in casualty care for years, and his hands moved steadily as he began to stem the catastrophic bleeding coming from Crumb's face and neck. It wasn't pretty, but trauma healing was less about finesse and more about keeping the patient alive. There would be time for reconstruction later. Will he need a blood replenisher? Moody asked, moving to hover over the grisly scene. In response, Harry extracted several vials of the potion from the pockets of his robes. After spelling the blood-replenishing potion into Crumb's stomach, Harry got to work on the rest of his injuries. Surprisingly, Crumb's airway was still intact, and whilst one of his ribs had punctured his lung, he was in remarkably good shape for someone a Sphinx had just mauled. Harry was sure he'd even be able to save Crumb's eye. Harry reset what bones he could before carefully transferring Crumb onto a conjured stretcher. He's in for a rough few days, Harry remarked as the stretcher levitated off the ground, but he should make a full recovery. He's lucky he's alive, Professor Sprout tutted as she led the way out of the maze. Lucky the Sphinx listened to Dumbledore, more like it, Moody grunted as he followed their party. If it wanted him dead, he would be. As Moody spoke, the glittering array of ruins that hovered over Crumb pulsed. Perhaps this isn't the best venue for your discussion, Harry murmured as he deciphered the ruins. Crumb's still conscious. Professor Sprout let out a tut of disapproval, the poor lamb. As they exited the maze, Harry ran a mental catalog of Crumb's injuries and began to formulate a treatment plan. Now that the internal bleeding was fixed, he'd need to address the swelling in Crumb's brain from being clubbed by the Sphinx's paw. Quickly, too. Not only for the neurological benefits, but so he could save Crumb's eye. He had a feeling the Bulgarian national Quidditch team wouldn't be too pleased if their star seeker went blind. Then there were the broken bones that would need Skella grow. Mind whirring, Harry entered the medical tent and transferred Crumb over to one of the beds, muttering an apology when Crumb let out a pained, gargled groan. Ouch, Medusa noted, semi-sympathetically as she joined him at Crumb's bedside. She'd managed to stand up, sort of like a cobra poised to strike, only with her gangly body. She reminded Harry more of a dog walking on its hind legs. Have you got any helpful contributions, or have you just come to stare? Harry snapped. Medusa hissed out a laugh before dropping back to the floor and slithering beneath the bed. I think I'll take a nap. Harry rolled his eyes before refocusing on the problem at hand, casting charms and summoning supplies like it was a well-rehearsed dance, time slipping away as skin knitted itself back together and deformed bones slid into their correct place. Occasionally, Medusa would call out a suggestion to speed things along, but she was more or less content to leave him to his own devices. Harry was busy calculating how much Dittany he could apply to Crumb's wounds before it interacted with the Skella Grow and left him permanently bald, when the tent flap opened and someone stepped inside. Mr. Crouch, Harry greeted, hoping he sounded authoritative and in control, rather than immensely confused as to the man's presence. Technically, he supposed that it wasn't not permitted for Mr. Crouch to be in the tent, but unless he was having a medical emergency, Harry couldn't think of a reason for the visit. Even Headmaster Kakarov hadn't visited, and his pupil had just had a near-fatal encounter with a Sphinx. Mr. Crouch didn't say anything, and it was then that Harry recalled the conversation he'd had with Percy Weasley at the Yule Ball. He's been rather confused, I suppose. It's the oddest thing. We'll have a conversation one day, and the next, he'll deny it ever happened. They'd been standing in the ankle-deep snow, and the festivities in the castle had nearly drowned out Percy's soft baritone. Sometimes his words don't make sense. He'll speak in English, but the way he says it makes it impossible to understand him. From Percy's description, Harry had figured Crouch was a victim of Hatter's disease, a curious affliction that affected those who misused thinking caps. Perhaps that was the reason for his visit. But then, so quick that he nearly missed it, a spasm that rippled across Mr. Crouch's face. It was an unconscious, uncontrolled twitch that twisted his lips, his jaw shifting as if he were trying to say something, but couldn't figure out how to arrange his muscles to form the words. In fact, it reminded Harry a little of his own struggles with mutism. What the behavior did not fit was Hatter's disease. Hatter's disease was disruptive and frustrating for the people around the afflicted. The patient themselves rarely recognized that their speech was cluttered or jumbled. If Crouch really had Hatter's, he would have been babbling about one thing or another, not glaring at him from the entrance of the medical tent. So, what was wrong with Bartemius Crouch? Harry cleared his throat and prompted, "May I assist you with anything?" Another facial spasm, this time accompanied by the slow rise of a finger, which he jabbed in Harry's direction. But as with the muscles in his face, Crouch's movements were jerky, like he wasn't entirely sure how to move them. How on earth had his co-workers not reported anything? Harry was surprised the man could even leave his house, let alone wander into his tent.
Give me one moment, Mr. Crouch, Harry said in a soothing tone before turning back towards Crumb. He magicked the correct Skella Grow dosage into Crumb's stomach and grabbed his medical file, quickly beginning to document what he'd done in the file. Why don't you sit down on that bed there, and I can see to you in a moment, all right?
You're not supposed. You shouldn't be concerned. Harry glanced over his shoulder, only to find that Crouch had staggered towards him instead. Merlin's beard, Harry muttered, setting the chart on the table beside Crumb's bed before turning to catch Mr. Crouch. But before he could take a step, a glittering green wall of magic sprang up between them, arching over his head until he and Crumb were encased in a dome of light. At his feet, Medusa had reared up once more, her red eyes trained on Crouch. "What are you doing?" Harry hissed. "He's ill, he needs." "The face is not his own," she explained. "The magic wanes." Icy panic slid through Harry's nerves at her words.
If there was anything he'd learned since Medusa had come into his life, it was to trust her judgment on all things medical. And this time, it would seem, was no different. Harry watched in astonishment as Mr. Couch's form began to morph. His hair grew longer and lightened to a sandy blonde, his skin both aging and deeing as wrinkles formed and jowls disappeared, and his body shrinking several inches. In a matter of seconds, Mr. Crouch had been replaced by an entirely new person.
Who are you? Harry asked with far more confidence than he felt. He raised his wand at the stranger, although there was little he could do within Medusa's conjured sanctuary. Casting any offensive magic within the dome would break the spell. Still, he felt better with it raised between them and the stranger nonetheless.
You're a slippery one, aren't you, Potter? The man said, barely above a whisper. Always managing to slither out of things. Who are you? Harry repeated. Instead of answering, the man shot off a spell, neon blue and crackling with energy.
It collided with the sanctuary dome with a deafening bang that left him feeling as if his skeleton were rattling in his body. Still, the sanctuary held, absorbing the dark magic and protecting them from any real harm. Undeterred, the man shot off another curse, this one magenta and whistling audibly as it cut through the air. When it hit the dome, the magic ricocheted away, finding its target in the chatterbox, which exploded into a cloud of wood splinters. That's enough, Harry shouted, his voice portraying authority and confidence he did not feel. Get out of my. See to your patient, Medusa hissed. It went against every instinct, turning his back to the stranger, but Harry did as instructed and returned to Krum. He found the young man wide-eyed and alert, though, given the severity of his injuries, he could do no more than blink up at Harry in panic. The barrier, it's not impermeable, Harry said over his shoulder as he began to reattach Krum's retina. He'll be able to pass. He shall not desecrate the sanctuary, Medusa hissed with conviction. Finally accepting that his spells were useless against the dome, the stranger stumbled forward, his movements jerky and halting. He came to a stop mere centimeters from the boundary of the sanctuary, the light of it illuminating his wax skin to a sickly, sinister green. Slowly, he raised a hand. As if it could sense his intentions, the dome flared impossibly bright, and an audible buzz filled the tent, growing louder as the man's hand crept closer. And then, just as the tips of his fingers began to breach the sanctuary, his skin began to smoke. With a howl of agony, the man wrenched himself away, clutching his hand to his chest. What did you do? The stranger screamed, teeth gritted in pain, strings of saliva hanging from his lips. What did you do? Even though the man had very nearly tried to kill them only seconds before, the healer in Harry wanted to cross the boundary and help the man. No, Medusa hissed, almost as soon as the idea crossed his mind, he deserves this. This was barbaric, Harry thought with horror as he caught sight of the stranger's blackened, disfigured hand. When Medusa said the sanctuary would protect them, he never thought it would. Set someone on fire? Magically wither the man away? What was happening? He who wishes to desecrate the sanctuary must forfeit his life, Medusa explained, her red gaze never once leaving the sniveling figure of the man. That is the cost of betrayal. Outside the medical tent, the crowd roared to life, and he could just make out Ludo Bagman's voice, announcing an end to the tournament. Harry's stomach twisted, and it took every bit of willpower not to empty the contents of his stomach on the hospital floor. His life? It's killing him. He wished to offend magic. Magic does not take kindly to a mortal's hubris. At last, Medusa looked away, and it was as if Harry were looking at an ancient, primordial being, rather than the snake who slept in his bed and loved complaining about everything under the sun. Return to your patient. There is nothing you can do for the damned. Skin prickling with fear, Harry let out a ragged breath. Slowly, he backed away from the scene until the backs of his thighs hit Krum's bed. How long until? He prolonged his agony with his attempts to outsmart the sanctuary. She sounded almost smug as she said it. Medusa dropped to the ground and slithered beneath Krum's bed. Cover your head. You're in the presence of magic. Wordlessly, Harry reached over his shoulder and dragged his white hood over his head. His hands shook as he returned to Krum's side and resumed his work. He did his best to ignore the gasping sobs behind him, and he blinked rapidly, hoping to dispel his own tears. Krum's lips moved noiselessly as he attempted to speak. Even though Harry had already repaired the torn skin and ruptured tendons in Crumb's neck, it would take several more hours before he would regain the ability to speak. Rest. You're safe, Harry soothed, although his voice sounded hollow. He can't get past the barrier. But Crumb couldn't be consoled. He pushed away Harry's hands with a surprising amount of strength for someone who had been mauled by a sphinx less than an hour ago, and he struggled to sit up. Victor, please. You'll injure yourself more. And you don't need to see. There was a soft brush of fabric as someone entered the tent. Harry? How are you coming along? Harry tensed. With all of the, well, everything, he'd forgotten entirely that Madame Pomfrey had said she'd check in on him. He turned around just in time to watch the confusion settle onto his mentor's face. Merlin's beard, she muttered. Words began to spew out of his mouth in a rush, his panic warring for the relief that someone was around to fix this. He tried to attach us, and Medusa established a sanctuary, and he tried to cross it, and now I'm pretty sure he's. Barty? Madame Pomfrey asked, her voice coming out in a strangled squeak. Is that you? The stranger's head snapped up, and Harry could see the rot had crept up to his face, black following the paths of veins beneath his skin. His lips had withered away, exposing what looked more like charcoal than teeth, a steady stream of darkened bile dribbling down his chin. And yet, those eyes, despite the pain, there was something there, a spark of life, a stubborn fight that refused to be snuffed out. Harry knew exactly what would happen just before the stranger lifted his arm. His feet moved without giving it a conscious thought, but even then, he knew it wasn't enough. He emerged from the safety of the sanctuary just as the stranger uttered the curse. Avada Kedavra. In a flash of emerald light, Madame Pomfrey was hurled backwards, and Harry was screaming, running, reaching for her, but she was gone, out of reach. Gone, gone, gone. A hand around his ankle, a hook behind his navel, and soon, Harry was gone too. For the rest of his life, Harry would never be able to fully remember what happened that night. At most, it would return to him in pieces, like one of the photographs Adrian Pusey loved to take. A small vignette preserved in time, with little context or meaning. Perhaps that was for the best. Witnessing his mentor's murder was enough trauma. He didn't need to recall how the stranger had activated some hidden portkey and transported them to a graveyard. How the stranger's body had given out, turning to ashes and leaving nothing but a pile of robes and a wand behind. How a familiar armband lay feet away, the silver embroidery shimmering in the moonlight. How an impossibly tall man who looked unbearably like one of his dearest friends had bound him to a headstone, desecrated a grave, and cut off his own hand.
How Harry's own blood was used to resurrect one of the most evil wizards England had ever seen.
But what he could remember was this. Lord Voldemort, reborn, as he rose out of the cauldron of whatever unholy ritual that Aurelius Flint performed, his disinterest in both the stranger who had sacrificed his very life to bring Harry to him and the fact that Flint was steadily bleeding out after giving up his right hand to bring him back from the dead. Harry could remember how Voldemort had summoned his followers to him, berating each of them by name for abandoning him after his supposed death. Harry remembered how Voldemort had mocked him, how whatever scarce protection his mother had afforded him with her life, and yes, Voldemort remembered that quite clearly, too, was all for naught, that she had died in vain now that Harry's blood, her sacrifice, now ran through his veins. And of course, Harry would remember the pain. There was no forgetting the torment that he endured or what followed. He might have lost track of how long he was held under the torture curse, how many times Voldemort placed it on him, took it off, allowed him just enough time to breathe before starting again, but that pain. Crucio. It was pain, indescribable. Conscious thought was impossible in the face of such complete and utter agony. There would be a break in the pain, just enough time for Harry to catch his breath, air into his acid-flayed lungs, before. Crucio. Anguish. Breathe. Crucio. Hell, he was sure that it would never end. And when his sanity started to slip, he wondered if this had always been his life, if he had ever known anything other than excruciating pain. Imperio. Rise. Harry embraced the relief that came with the imperious curse, and a blissful haze settled over his mind. There was no more pain, if one ignored how his muscles and joints and bones and even his hair protested every movement. Which he did, as he clambered to his feet. And wasn't that a lovely thing? It was so kind, so merciful of Lord Voldemort. He stood in the center of a large group of masked people in dark cloaks. Death Eaters, his exhausted brain dimly supplied. They circled him like grotesque graveyard angels. Across from him stood Lord Voldemort himself, wearing a silken robe and looking more inhuman than Harry had ever seen him. Somehow, he was even larger than Harry remembered, towering over him by nearly a head, his excessive height only amplified by his skeletal body. "Welcome to my rebirth, Harry Potter," Voldemort said. The Death Eaters let out jeers of excitement, only to fall silent when Voldemort raised a large, long-fingered hand. "Tonight we face each other for the third time," Voldemort continued, his voice barely above a whisper. And yet even the wind seemed to fall silent, as desperate to hear his words as the Death Eaters that watched him on bated breath. "It is not often people escape from me when I have decided to kill them, Harry Potter. As such, I generously grant you the dignity of dying like a man. Now, pull out your wand," Voldemort commanded. Dutifully, Harry began to riffle through his pockets. After several moments, he raised his head and said in a dull, lifeless tone, "I don't have it." Voldemort's eyes narrowed, and he turned his eyes towards Aurelius Flint, as if Harry's wandless state were his fault. Through the blissful haze, Harry recognized that this was quite odd. Flint hadn't had a hand in Harry's abduction, after all. Still, Voldemort asked Flint, "Where is the boy's wand?" Flint stepped to Harry's side and began to search him for a wand. It took some time on account of Mr. Flint only having one hand and all. When he had nothing to show apart from smearing his blood over Harry's white robes, Flint desperately began to search the pile of robes that used to belong to the stranger. If Harry cared enough, he might have explained that he'd probably dropped it in the medical tent. But as it was, he didn't care particularly about anything at the moment. Or did he? There was an injured man mere feet from him. Shouldn't he want to help? After another moment of fruitless searching, Flint needlessly concluded, "He must have dropped it, my lord." Voldemort's Arlet eyes narrowed. "Give him Crouches." Something akin to curiosity flickered in the back of Harry's mind. Crouch? Barty Crouch? Was that the name of the stranger? He didn't look like the Barty Crouch that he knew, but then again, did it matter? Harry didn't think it did. Didn't think of much, really. Not thinking was easier, less painful. A long length of colored wood was extracted from the stranger's robes, and Flint shoved it into Harry's hand. Flint's blood speckled the wand, but Harry accepted it dutifully, rolling the long length of wood between his fingers. He could feel a biting, wild magic flowing through it, like a barely constrained rabid dragon. Blissfully relaxed, Harry watched as Voldemort raised his wand, just as he had nearly 15 years ago. And just as he had then, Harry did nothing to stop it. And why should he? There was no stopping the killing curse. He might as well accept it. And wasn't it nicer to have a peaceful death, anyway? Except, he didn't think he wanted to die. "It is time to die, Harry Potter," Voldemort said. "We shall duel. I assume they teach you these things at Hogwarts?" No, Harry hadn't taken a traditional class at Hogwarts in years. It was no surprise that he had no formal dueling training. The closest he got to a proper duel was trading spells with his friends. Around them, the Death Eaters tittered out laughs. Voldemort tsked. "All the more the pity for you," he said. "At least it shall be swift." How kind of Voldemort to place him under the Imperious Curse in his last moments so that he wouldn't be afraid, wouldn't feel anything besides the vague sort of happiness the curse imparted.
Although seeing his family would have also been nice. Unbidden, his father's face appeared in his mind. He hadn't seen him the first time Voldemort had tried to kill him. He'd seen John and his mother, of course, but not his father.
Harry's face twitched into something almost resembling a frown. He thought that, maybe, he would very much like to hug his father one last time.
Voldemort continued. "The first thing one does in a duel is bow to their opponent."
The fuzzy feeling in his brain increased, and Harry had the overwhelming urge to stoop into a low bow. He was halfway bent when he thought he really didn't fancy bowing to his mother's murderer. "Bow," an insistent voice whispered in the back of his mind. But Harry didn't want to bow. He didn't want to be here at all, actually. "Bow," the voice said again, fainter yet somehow more intense than before. No, he rather didn't think he would. Bow. No, he would not bow to this monster. And if he were going to die, it would damn well be on his own terms.
Like a rubber band that had stretched too far, something snapped against Harry's mind. The floaty feeling evaporated, and every pain his abused body had endured came rushing back to him tenfold. He wanted to cry out and fall to his knees, but he forced his chin high. He glared at Voldemort with all the fierceness he didn't feel, but he managed to muster nonetheless.
No, he didn't have the energy to shout, but his whispered defiance held the same power. There was a long moment where even the wind seemed to fall silent, waiting for Voldemort's reply. Curious, Voldemort said at last, his head tilting as he considered Harry. Then, before Harry could react, Voldemort descended on him with an agility that belied both his age and recently reincarnated body. He wrapped his pale, spider-like fingers around Harry's jaw, squeezing, forcing his head back at an angle so severe that one wrong move and Harry feared his neck would break. Harry grit his teeth as pain exploded, white-hot, through his scar. Still, he refused to give Voldemort the satisfaction of crying out in pain. "You defy me." Voldemort stooped until they were nearly nose to nose. "I should not be surprised," he continued, his voice dropping so that only Harry could hear him. "I have always known your power, but I have allowed this weed to grow for far too long." Allowed him? The idea was almost laughable. Harry had become who he was, not because of Voldemort, but despite him. For every word stolen from the tip of his tongue or lodged in his throat, Harry had clawed his way towards success. For every monster and madman Voldemort had thrown in his path, Harry had surmounted them, defeated the hardships that fully qualified wizards would have struggled to overcome. And yet, it was the objective, absolute truth that, whether he liked it or not, Voldemort had defined him. Had shaped him just as much as his mother and father and brother, his uncles, his friends and mentors. He was an amalgamation of all the people who knew him, who had changed his life and shaped his world. Try as he might, Harry was unable to divorce himself from Voldemort. And Harry hated him for it. Rage seared through Harry's veins, and with it, a wild sort of magic. His wild, temperamental, unconstrained magic. It flooded his synapses and burned his fingertips, practically foaming at the mouth like an attack dog, aching to be released. "I am what you've made me," Harry hissed. The floodgates opened. Magic surged from his every pore like a geyser, releasing a torrent of feral magic with a sonic boom. Voldemort's nails raked across Harry's face as the two men were thrown in opposite directions by the resultant shockwave. Harry's body cartwheeled through the air, landing some 20 meters from where they'd stood, crumpling in a heap behind a row of dilapidated headstones. His vision went black from the pain, the air knocked out of his lungs. He felt several of his ribs fracture on impact. Lungs burning and muscles spasming. All Harry could do was wait out the pain. When his vision cleared, Harry could see, through gaps between the headstones, that a massive crater had been carved out of the earth, exposing century-old coffins and the yellowing bones of skeletons. The remaining grass had caught fire, with flames quickly licking their way towards the panicked Death Eaters. Only, Harry's vision had to have gone funny, because the fire appeared green. Dazed, Harry watched as some of the Death Eaters drew their wands and shot jets of water towards the fire, which reacted like a grease fire, flaring 10 feet high until a solid wall of flames stood between him and the Death Eaters. And Voldemort, Harry presumed. Get up, now, before he comes back. It was a miracle that Voldemort hadn't already descended on him. Still, with each passing moment, the likelihood of it happening skyrocketed. And so, ears ringing, Harry forced his aching muscles, still twitching from the onslaught of the Cruciatus Curse, to bend and shift until he stood, straight-backed, and faced the destruction he'd created, awaiting his inevitable death. There was no defeating Voldemort. Harry would die when he faced him again, plain and simple. He would die, and nobody would know what happened in the graveyard. His family and friends would never know what happened to him. People would never know what happened to Madame Pomfrey. It was a bleak reality, but he hardened himself to it. He wouldn't beg for mercy, and he wouldn't cry. Harry would die on his feet, and he'd die fighting. But then, unbidden and entirely unwelcome, Snape's voice, of all peoples, drifted through his head, as cool and calm as a summer breeze. In his mind's eye, Harry was 13 again, prone in a hospital bed as Professor Snape scowled down his hooked nose. There is a difference, Mr. Potter, between bravery and martyrdom. between cowardice and running so that you may fight another day. A Slytherin should know the distinction. It had been a chastisement then, a rebuke for impulsive recklessness that could have gotten him and his friends killed. He'd run off, thinking he was qualified to fix a problem best left to fully trained adults. Back then, he'd lacked any sort of discernment in dangerous situations, his judgment blinded by his ego and juvenile sense of invincibility. But now, at 16, he could see that there was another option besides dying like a martyr at the hands of Voldemort. He could run, now, whilst Voldemort and the Death Eaters were distracted by the fire. He could see his father and brother and Ginny and Cedric in. The hope that bloomed in his chest was quickly snuffed out by the full-body spasm that ripped through him. With a strangled gasp, Harry collapsed as an aftershock. The phantom pain of Voldemort's Cruciatus curse burned his nerves. All conscious thought evaded him as his body seized and shook, his body contorting into unnatural and grotesque angles. The episode lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but when it was over, Harry was dripping with sweat, and the metallic tang of blood coated his tongue. Through the pain and exhaustion, Harry forced himself to think, to take inventory of the situation and his abilities. Clearly, he had sustained substantial nerve damage while he was held under the torture curse. If he were suffering from aftershocks that powerful, running would be out of the question. Besides, standing alone had taken nearly all of his energy. Not to mention he'd look rather obvious, limping off. Maybe it would be possible if he had his invisibility cloak, but that was at Hogwarts.
If only he'd learned how to apparate. There had been lessons at Hogwarts for 6th and 7th years, but he'd elected to forego them, stupidly believing that he could learn later. His father had even planned to teach him over the summer holidays. Not that it would do him any good now.
No escape would be impossible. But what else could he do? Transfigure himself into a gravestone and hide. He still had Crouch's wand, the light wood miraculously intact, clutched in his hand so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The answer came to him at once, and he felt stupid for not thinking of it first. Working as quickly as his exhausted muscles would allow, Harry began setting his broken ribs. Crouch's wand rebelled against the healing magic, spluttering like a violently plucked violin string.
Harry let out a strangled scream of frustration. He'd wasted enough time already. He didn't have the time to deal with a stubborn wand. He forced his magic through, and magic eagerly complied, gushing from him, through him, as if it had been desperately waiting for him to give it permission to act.
Ozone and eucalyptus perfumed the air, and the wand warmed beneath his fingers, hairline cracks forming near the tip. But even as the wand actively fought him, its will was no match for Harry's, and in an icy rush, he felt his ribs knit themselves back together. Before the magic had a chance to settle or dissipate, Harry was focusing on his heartbeat, both the human one that rabbited in his chest like a panicked animal and the steady animal that reflected his truest, deepest self. He surrendered his control to the animal, and magic washed over him as his body shrank and contorted seamlessly into a hair. And then Harry slipped into the dark June night, the animagus form he had once thought so embarrassing proving its worth again. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.